Hey guys, tonight we're going somewhere grim. Not medieval huts, not filthy straw beds, but concrete walls and guarded fences where the lights never went out and silence was rarely safe. This is not about knights or castles, but about men in white coats who traded humanity for experiments that should never have existed. We're stepping into the shadowed world of Nazi biological weapons, where science stopped being science and turned into cruelty with a clipboard. It isn't pretty, it isn't comforting, and yet here we are, drifting slowly into the details. Before we sink into it, take a breath, dim your screen a little lower, maybe turn on the fan so there's a soft hum in the background. If you're listening in bed, let the sheets settle around you. If you're on the couch, find a spot that doesn't ache too much. This isn't going to be cheerful, but it will be steady. The story begins not with explosions or tanks rolling into a city, but with an idea. The idea that war could be fought not just with bullets and bombs, but with invisible enemies too small to see. Germs, viruses, toxins, parasites, all the things nature invented for its own reasons were collected, studied, and twisted into weapons. The men behind it wore uniforms, carried doctors' titles, and spoke the language of research. But their work was more like torture disguised as discovery. To them, human beings were no longer people. They were material. They were data points. They were something to be infected, starved, frozen, poisoned, and dissected in the hope of creating knowledge that could give Germany an edge in total war. You'll hear about names you might already know, and others you've never heard because history tried to bury them. You'll hear about the camps where these experiments happened, the diseases they bred, the substances they injected, the so-called studies they conducted while ignoring screams, and the notebooks that filled with results that no one should have wanted to read. Some of it will sound absurd, like seawater being tested as if thirst could be solved with an ocean in a cup. Some of it will sound technical, like bone transplants performed with no anesthesia. And most of it will sound cruel in ways that are hard to put into words. The Nazis called it science. They said it was necessary. They said it was progress. But what it really was a long series of deadly experiments where people were treated as less than animals, as numbers, as test subjects who would never leave the room alive. The legacy of that cruelty still lingers. Some of the knowledge gained was quietly hidden away. Some of the scientists responsible were punished. Others escaped into new careers under new governments that suddenly forgot about justice, when rockets and biological data seemed more useful than trials. So tonight, as the hum of your own world keeps you steady, we'll drift back into that time, into that place where the line between medicine and murder was erased by ideology and ambition. Settle in and let's begin. You open your eyes and there is no sunrise waiting for you. There is no rooster, no bird outside a window, no hint of morning through curtains. Instead, you wake into a fluorescent hum that never stops, the kind of light that flattens shadows but never feels warm. It flickers sometimes, buzzing like a trapped insect, but it never goes out. The room around you isn't a home, not even close. It is white, it is tiled, and it smells faintly of disinfectant layered over something metallic, something iron heavy that lingers in your nose. You've woken up in the world of Nazi laboratories, places where science no longer meant helping people, but testing them until they broke. The bed you're lying on isn't really a bed. It's more like a table with a thin sheet thrown across it, stiff from washing in boiling water that never quite scrubbed away the stains. The mattress is absent because comfort isn't part of the experiment. You shift and the sound echoes off concrete walls. You're not supposed to move. You're not supposed to speak. You're supposed to lie there and wait until someone comes through the door with a clipboard. The clipboard is more important than you. That's what you notice first. The men who arrive wear coats, polished boots, sometimes gloves, sometimes not, but always the clipboard. They write down numbers, temperatures, pulse counts, survival times. You're not a name. You're not even a prisoner number carved onto cloth. Here, in this room, you're a measurement. A line of data that will be compared against the next person. Outside this small space, there are more like it. Rooms stacked inside larger buildings fenced off inside camps, and camps hidden behind barbed wire and guard towers that keep the outside world away. People imagine laboratories as shining places of glassware and microscopes, but here it's different. Here, a laboratory is a camp barrack with a stove in the corner, jars on shelves, cages with rats, tanks filled with mosquitoes, and a smell of carbolic acid sharp enough to sting your throat. Scientists walk past lines of exhausted prisoners as if they were moving past furniture. No one looks at their faces for long. Faces are temporary here. This is the world that built itself in secret, under the banner of progress, under the flag of war. It's a place where the morning begins not with a warm drink, but with a guard unlocking the door, calling out names that no one wants to hear, pulling people into a room where there are syringes already laid out on a tray. They tell you it's an experiment. They tell you nothing else. And what follows could be anything. A fever that rises and never falls. A freezing bath so cold it burns. A drink that tastes like seawater. Or an injection that makes your chest tighten until breathing feels optional. The soundscape is different here too. You don't hear laughter or idle chatter or the daily rhythm of life. You hear boots striking the floor, metal clinking as instruments are prepared, coughs from throats that will not clear, and the scratch of pencils across graph paper. Even silence is loud in these walls, because silence means waiting for the next test to begin. To live in this environment is to understand that time doesn't belong to you. Time belongs to the man at the desk, to the one who decides how many hours you will spend shivering in ice water, how many days you will be kept without food, how many injections your arm can take before veins collapse. You measure life in experiments, not in days. If you're not chosen, you wait. If you are chosen, you survive if your body allows it, and if it doesn't, you're erased with a line in a notebook. This is what waking up in a Nazi laboratory meant. There is no window to tell you morning has come. The guards and the doctors decide when your day begins and when it ends. They are searching for answers, but not the kind that help anyone. They want to know how much seawater a man can drink before he dies. They want to know how frostbite destroys tissue step by step. They want to know how long it takes for malaria to reduce a strong body into trembling weakness. They want numbers, not names. The walls themselves hold secrets. You could trace your fingers along them and feel the dampness of concrete, the cold that seeps through no matter how many coats you wear, but you would also feel history pressed into those surfaces. The echoes of coughing, the scuff of chains, the faint trail of shoes that dragged when walking became too difficult. These laboratories were built in plain sight, yet kept invisible by fear. The guards outside made sure no one entered without permission, and no one left at all. Sometimes, the scientists told themselves it was for the greater good. They spoke of advancing medicine, of discovering cures, of protecting soldiers on the battlefield. They used the language of science to describe what they were doing, but the reality never matched the words. There were no cures here, no treatments, no healing. There was only testing until death, and then dissection afterward. If something useful was written down in the process, they called it progress. If nothing useful came, they shrugged and prepared the next group. It's hard to say what felt worse, the cruelty itself, or the normalcy with which it was carried out. For the scientists, this was daily work. They walked into the lab, adjusted their coats, sharpened their pencils, and prepared their samples. For the prisoners, it was daily terror. Each step, each sound of boots approaching, each clang of a door could mean they were next. The world outside the barbed wire kept turning, but inside, the hours stretched into experiments that didn't care about endings. You might imagine that such places were hidden in distant forests or underground bunkers. Some were, but others stood beside the camps in buildings that looked ordinary enough from the outside. A passerby might see only chimneys and doors, not the rows of tables inside, where experiments unfolded like routines. That was part of the horror. These weren't hidden lairs from a nightmare. They were ordinary buildings used for extraordinary cruelty. So here you are, awake on a table that pretends to be a bed, staring at a ceiling that hums with fluorescent light. The air tastes of bleach and iron. You don't know what they'll test today. Maybe they'll inject you with something that makes your stomach twist into knots. Maybe they'll lower your body into freezing water and hold a stopwatch. Maybe they'll strap you to a chair and make you breathe gas that leaves burns inside your lungs. The only certainty is that you don't get to choose. Every corner of this place is designed to remind you of that. The locked doors, the steel instruments, the shelves lined with jars of preserved specimens, the guards who don't speak unless it's to order. Even the sound of a pencil scratching notes is a reminder that your life is being measured, that your suffering is being timed. You become an experiment before you understand what's happening, and once it begins, there is no pause, no appeal, no way to step out. And yet, outside this room, there are more laboratories. Some focused on malaria, filling cages with mosquitoes and releasing them into rooms where prisoners sat helplessly, waiting to be bitten. Some worked with typhus, spreading the disease deliberately to watch fevers climb. Some tested chemical burns, dripping mustard gas onto skin to see how fast it blistered. Others tried bizarre ideas, like making seawater drinkable, pouring salt into cups, and forcing men to drink until they collapsed from dehydration. Each lab had its specialty, and each specialty had its victims. Waking up in this world didn't mean starting a new day. It meant starting a new round of tests. Your body wasn't yours anymore. It was a site for data collection, a field for someone else's questions. And if you thought of escape, you didn't say it aloud, because even if you managed to slip past the guard at the door, there was still the barbed wire, the dogs, the guns, and the towers waiting. The laboratories weren't only about experiments, they were about control. Control over knowledge, control over bodies, control over life and death. The Nazis believed that through these tests they could unlock ways to fight wars more efficiently, to kill enemies more effectively, to harden soldiers against the elements. They thought suffering was a tool, that death was a measurement, and that the human body was nothing more than a machine to dismantle and study. It is difficult to describe the feeling of waking up in such a place, but maybe it's enough to say this. The air itself felt heavier. Heavier with fear. Heavier with chemicals. Heavier with the knowledge that you weren't supposed to leave. Each morning wasn't morning. It was just another experiment waiting to begin. And as you blink under the buzzing light, you realise that the hum in the ceiling never stops. It keeps going, just like the experiments, just like the notes, filling page after page, while names and faces vanish into numbers. You didn't get to choose where you woke up, and you certainly didn't get to choose how the world around you decided that people could be treated like specimens. To understand why these laboratories existed at all, you have to step backward, before the white coats and the syringes, to a time when Germany was rebuilding itself after defeat and humiliation, and where ambition began to blur into something much darker. Science, in theory, was supposed to be the great light of the modern world. The 20th century had promised miracles. Vaccines had already saved millions, new surgical techniques were reducing deaths on the battlefield, and chemistry had given industries the ability to build and destroy on a scale no one had imagined. Yet, in the wrong hands, those same tools became weapons. The men who called themselves scientists in the Reich wore two faces. One face was polished, clean, professional. They spoke about research, about advancement, about curing diseases and strengthening the nation. The other face was something closer to fanaticism. They believed that knowledge didn't need morality. They believed that ethics were a weakness, that compassion slowed progress, that certain lives could be discarded if they stood in the way of discovery. Once that thought took root, everything else became possible. Germany in the 1930s was not short on talented doctors. Many of them had studied at the finest universities in Europe. They could quote anatomy texts, recite chemistry formulas, and publish papers with long words and precise graphs. But alongside their education came the heavy weight of ideology. From the very beginning of the Nazi rise, science was dragged into politics. Biology became less about cells and organs and more about race. Medicine stopped asking how to heal and started asking who deserved healing in the first place. The language they used was cold, bureaucratic, but powerful. They spoke of purity, of hygiene, of strengthening the body of the nation. They described entire populations as infections to be cut out, as problems to be solved, as material to be studied. It sounded clinical, almost reasonable, until you saw what it meant in practice. The Jewish population, the Roma, the disabled, the political prisoners, they became the raw material for a new kind of science, one where consent didn't exist and survival was never expected. The shift didn't happen overnight. It grew slowly in lectures, in meetings, in pamphlets distributed to young medical students. They were told that as doctors, their highest duty was not to the individual patient, but to the health of the folk, the people as a whole. If one person had to suffer, even die, to protect the strength of the collective, then that was considered acceptable. Step by step, the oath to do no harm was rewritten into an oath to serve the state. In this atmosphere, experiments that once would have been unthinkable started to sound logical. What if, they asked, we could find a way to make soldiers withstand freezing temperatures on the Eastern Front? What if we could discover how long a man could survive drinking seawater in case ships were stranded at sea? What if we could test poisons directly on humans, so we knew exactly how they worked? Each question was presented as practical, as useful, as necessary for survival in a world at war. And for every what if, there was always a supply of prisoners who could provide the answers. It wasn't just individuals like Mengele, though his name became infamous. It was an entire system, universities and institutes, professors and students, military officers and civilian doctors, all pulling in the same direction. They held conferences where data from camp experiments was presented as if it were ordinary research. They published papers without acknowledging that the subjects had never volunteered, that they had died in the process. They normalized it. They turned murder into method. The most chilling part is how ordinary it looked on paper. A study might describe the effects of freezing water on human physiology, with careful charts and measured times of survival. Another might detail the progression of typhus, noting the stages of fever, rash, delirium, and death. Stripped of context, they looked like scientific documents, but behind every line was a human being, shivering, coughing, gasping, pleading, and finally silent. The cruelty disappeared into the numbers. Why did ethics go missing? Because they were erased deliberately. Because in classrooms, young doctors were told that compassion was weakness, that hesitation was betrayal, that empathy was a distraction from duty. Because professional ambition mixed with ideology, and careers could be advanced by producing results, no matter how they were obtained. Because fear played its part too. To refuse, to question, to hesitate was to risk your own safety, your own position, your own survival. And so many chose to continue, to stay silent, to keep their heads down and their pens moving. It's easy to imagine that the people running these experiments were monsters in human form, somehow different from everyone else. But the truth is worse. They were ordinary men, some with families, some with children, some who still kissed their wives goodnight before returning to work the next morning. They didn't see themselves as murderers. They saw themselves as professionals, as patriots, as pioneers. The horror wasn't that they were different. The horror was that they weren't. In the laboratories, this absence of ethics became the air itself. If you walked through those corridors, you would see rows of glass jars, shelves of preserved organs, piles of papers filled with neatly drawn graphs. You would see men in coats discussing results over coffee, while in the next room, someone lay strapped to a table, waiting for the next injection. To the doctors, there was no contradiction. The person on the table wasn't seen as a person at all. They were a variable, and variables don't cry. Outside the lab, propaganda helped cover the cracks. The public was told that medical science under the Reich was advancing rapidly, that German doctors were leading the world in new discoveries. Articles praised breakthroughs in disease prevention, in surgery, in nutrition. No mention was made of the camps, of the freezing baths, of the mosquitoes buzzing against the skin of prisoners who couldn't swat them away. The lies were smooth, the surface polished, and beneath it, the rot deepened. It wasn't only Germany watching. Other nations noticed the speed of German science, the apparent strides being made, but they didn't see the methods, or perhaps they didn't want to. And when the war ended, some of those same nations found themselves asking whether the knowledge, however it was gained, could still be useful. That is why some of the scientists who should have faced punishment instead found new laboratories waiting for them abroad. Ethics had gone missing in Germany, but they didn't always reappear elsewhere. If you were one of the prisoners waking up on that table, you didn't care about ideology or scientific debates. You cared about the footsteps approaching, the sound of instruments being set out, the next wave of pain coming. But behind those walls, the bigger picture was already shaping itself. The rise of Nazi science was not just about experiments. It was about transforming medicine into a weapon and erasing the idea that patients mattered more than the state. And once that erasure was complete, anything could be justified. A disease outbreak became an opportunity. A wound became a test subject. A cry for help became background noise. A death became a data point. The laboratories kept running, the notebooks kept filling, and the silence of ethics left space for cruelty to thrive without interruption. The strange part is how methodical it all seemed. The men in charge weren't frantic or chaotic. They were calm, orderly, systematic. They scheduled experiments. They divided subjects into groups. They set up control trials. They followed the structure of science with precision. But without morality, precision only made the cruelty sharper. It gave it the weight of legitimacy. It made murder look like research. When you imagine these places, you might expect chaos, but the reality was quieter. The scratch of pens, the drip of liquid into glass beakers, the measured tick of a stopwatch. Cruelty didn't need to shout. It could whisper through routine, through paperwork, through experiments conducted with the same tone as measuring rainfall or testing soil. And that quiet made it harder to resist, harder to recognise, harder to stop. As the war deepened, the demand for results only grew stronger. The Eastern Front was freezing soldiers to death, so the laboratories froze prisoners in icy tanks. Naval battles left men adrift at sea, so experiments forced others to drink seawater. Disease tore through the ranks, so malaria, typhus, tuberculosis, and cholera were spread in controlled conditions inside the camps. Every problem faced by the army became a question for the laboratories, and every answer came at the cost of human lives. That is why ethics disappeared. They weren't lost accidentally. They were stripped away piece by piece, until nothing remained but the pursuit of results. And in that vacuum, science became indistinguishable from cruelty, medicine from murder, research from torture. The laboratories thrived, the data piled up, and the people inside them vanished. And as you lie awake under that fluorescent hum, staring at the ceiling that never darkens, you realise that this is not just about waking up in a single room. It's about waking up in a world where science, stripped of its soul, can become as dangerous as any weapon forged in steel. The footsteps approach again. The clipboard is ready. And somewhere down the corridor, another door opens for the next test to begin. The footsteps in the hallway never belonged to just one man, but sometimes they carried a different weight. There were the ordinary doctors, the ones who followed orders and scribbled notes without much flair. And then there was the figure who became infamous, the one whose name would echo far beyond the walls of Auschwitz, Josef Mengele. To some, he was just another physician in uniform, but to those who saw him step into the barracks, he was something closer to a nightmare walking on polished boots. Mengele had the air of someone who enjoyed the performance. He wasn't just recording data. He was orchestrating it. Where others shuffled papers and muttered to assistants, he strolled confidently, as if the corridors were his stage, and the prisoners his unwilling audience. He earned nicknames whispered under breath, never spoken aloud when guards could hear. The Angel of Death. The doctor who smiled as he selected who would live another day and who would be sent to the gas chambers. A flick of his hand decided fates in the selection lines, and when he entered the laboratories, the same gesture meant the beginning of yet another experiment. Curiosity was the word he liked to use. Scientific curiosity. He wanted to know what made bodies different, how diseases progressed, how wounds healed, how far the human body could be pushed. But curiosity without limits is never harmless. In Mengele's world, curiosity became cruelty with an endless supply of test subjects. He was especially drawn to twins. For him, identical siblings were nature's laboratory, perfect for side-by-side comparison. One twin could be infected with a disease, the other left untreated and then results compared. One twin could undergo surgery, the other observed as a control. Sometimes both would be killed, so their organs could be studied after death. Children were led into his experiments not with explanations, but with reassurances that sounded like kindness. They were told they would be given better food, better clothes, even toys. For a brief moment, hope flickered in their eyes. And then came the needles, the incisions, the endless examinations that treated them not as children, but as puzzles to be solved. The factory of cruelty did not run on machines. It ran on people who had no choice but to participate. Assistants, guards, nurses, even other prisoners were forced to help carry out the experiments. Mengele stood at the centre, directing, asking questions, demanding results. His coat was always immaculate, his hair neatly combed, his demeanour calm. He didn't look like a man committing atrocities. He looked like a professional, which somehow made it worse. He proved that you didn't need to look like a monster to behave like one. Day after day, he walked into the barracks, selecting his subjects with an ease that made resistance pointless. The prisoners who were chosen sometimes didn't even know why. A child with blue eyes might catch his attention. A man with a limp might be considered useful. A woman carrying a child could be ordered aside. Each choice seemed casual, but each one opened the door to pain that rarely ended in survival. Among his obsessions was the idea of racial difference. He believed that by studying bodies closely enough, he could find proof for Nazi theories of superiority and inferiority. Measurements were taken obsessively: the distance between eyes, the shape of a skull, the angle of a jaw. It was anthropology twisted into something grotesque. Charts filled with numbers, comparisons stacked upon comparisons, all in the hope of showing that some people were worth less than others. And every page of data was written in blood. For the prisoners, his arrival was a silent terror. You never looked him directly in the eye, but you couldn't escape his gaze either. When he pointed, there was no appeal. When he called your number, there was no refusal. Some were marched straight to the chambers. Others were led into his laboratory, where the smell of formaldehyde mixed with disinfectant, and the sound of children crying was as routine as the clink of glass. The cruelty was never random. It was systematic, recorded carefully, as though the suffering could be justified by the neatness of the handwriting in the notebooks. If a prisoner collapsed during a procedure, another would be brought in to replace them. The work never paused. The curiosity never stopped asking questions. What happens when a body is injected with chemicals that clot the blood instantly? How does the body respond to different poisons? How long can someone survive without food? Without air? without dignity. There was no shortage of answers, because there was no shortage of victims. Auschwitz was full of them, and Mengele treated the camp as his own endless supply of experimental material. Each new transport of prisoners meant new opportunities. Each selection line meant new possibilities for testing. The camp itself became an extension of the laboratory, a place where death was both the background and the tool. The cruelty was sharpened by a strange contradiction. Mengele could be polite, even charming, when he wanted to be. He spoke to some of his subjects with kindness, asking about their health, their families, even smiling at children before sending them into his experiments. This was not compassion. This was control. It disarmed people, made them lower their guard for a moment before the truth was revealed. The smile was just another weapon, a way to make cruelty feel almost normal. When you think about this factory of curiosity, you might imagine wild chaos, but the reality was more organised than that. Rows of notes, samples stored in jars, specimens labelled carefully, all arranged in cabinets. Assistants knew their roles. Guards kept the line moving. And Mengele himself moved between stations like a conductor, guiding an orchestra of suffering. It was routine, and that routine made the horror worse, because it meant it wasn't madness. It was planned, calculated, deliberate. Some prisoners remembered the sound of his whistle as he entered the block. Sharp, cheerful, casual. To them, it meant dread. To him, it was just another day at work. And that was the essence of his cruelty. He didn't see it as cruelty at all. He saw it as research, as duty, as contribution. Every injection, every dissection, every child torn from a parent was to him a step forward in knowledge. The fact that it ended in death was not a problem. It was simply part of the process. His obsession with twins created stories that are still painful to read. Children lined up for measurements, for blood draws, for injections that left them weak and feverish. Sometimes dye was injected into their eyes to try and change their colour. Sometimes surgeries were performed with no anaesthesia, leaving scars and agony. And when one twin died, the other was often killed soon after, so their bodies could be dissected side by side. The cruelty was total, and yet the experiments produced nothing of real scientific value. The data was riddled with errors, the methods flawed, the results useless. The only legacy left behind was suffering. The factory ran not only on Mengele's ideas, but on the silence of those around him. Nurses handed him instruments. Guards brought in prisoners. Fellow doctors pretended not to see too much. The machinery of the camp supported him, and as long as results were written down and reported, no one questioned the means. Curiosity became a cover for killing, and science became an excuse for sadism. Even now, decades later, the name Mengele carries weight. It has become a shorthand for cruelty in the guise of medicine. But in those years, inside those walls, he was just one man among many who chose ambition over humanity. What made him stand out was not only his role in the selections, not only his obsession with twins, but the way he seemed to relish the power. The laboratory wasn't just a workplace for him. It was a stage where he could play the part of both scientist and executioner. If you were lying on one of those tables, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the footsteps to approach, you didn't think of ideology, or science, or curiosity. You thought of survival. You thought of pain. You thought of how long the light above you would keep buzzing before it flickered out. And when the door opened, and the polished boots clicked across the floor, and the clipboard came out, you knew Curiosity was about to begin again, and you were the experiment. The factory of cruelty did not close at night. It continued as long as there were subjects to use, as long as there were questions to ask, as long as there were men willing to write answers in neat handwriting while ignoring the screams. And in that sense, Josef Mengele was never alone. He was just one conductor in a larger orchestra, one man whose name became infamous, while many others went on working quietly, their own curiosity just as deadly, their own notebooks just as full. The footsteps that echoed in the laboratories weren't just about curiosity, they were also about preparation. War was everywhere, and the Reich wanted more than just weapons of steel. They wanted the human body itself to be weaponized, hardened, unbreakable. The dream was a soldier who could march longer, fight harder, endure more, and resist the invisible enemies that usually cut armies down: cold, hunger, disease, exhaustion. Bullets were one thing, germs were another. And in a world where entire campaigns were lost to infection, the generals wanted doctors to make sure German troops never fell the same way. The laboratory became an extension of the battlefield. Instead of trenches, there were cages filled with mosquitoes. Instead of artillery, there were flasks of bacteria, syringes loaded with toxins, vials of chemical gas. Prisoners were the testing ground, the stand-ins for soldiers, the ones who would face the diseases before the army did. Each experiment was framed as a question. How much could the human body take, and how could it be manipulated to serve the state? Gas was one of the earliest obsessions. The memories of the First World War still hung heavy, the fields of France and Belgium, where clouds of chlorine and mustard gas rolled through trenches, leaving men blinded and coughing until they drowned in their own fluids. That war had shown what chemical weapons could do, and the Reich was determined not to be unprepared. If enemies used gas again, German soldiers needed protection. Masks, ointments, treatments, resistance. But instead of building safety through design alone, the laboratories decided to build it through flesh. Prisoners were locked into chambers and exposed to different gases in controlled amounts. Some were forced to inhale chlorine, others mustard gas, others compounds even more experimental. Their lungs burned, their throats closed, their skin blistered. Doctors stood nearby with notebooks, timing how long it took for breathing to fail, how long until collapse. They applied salves and rinses to see if anything slowed the damage. They tested antidotes by injecting one prisoner and leaving another untreated. If the antidote failed, both died. If it succeeded, one lived long enough to suffer again another day. The logic was brutal but simple. Better that prisoners die now than soldiers later. That was the justification. The soldier's life was valuable. The prisoner's life was not. And so the chambers kept filling, and the notes kept growing, and the line between medicine and weapon blurred until there was no difference left. Then there were the germs. Nature's weapons, carried not in shells or bombs, but in the air, in the water, in the bite of an insect. Typhus, cholera, dysentery, malaria. These diseases had brought down armies before, and the Reich wanted immunity. The laboratories turned into breeding grounds, where lice were cultivated in boxes strapped to prisoners' legs, where mosquitoes were kept in cages and released in rooms to bite unwilling bodies. Each fever that rose was recorded. Each death was measured. If one prisoner survived, blood samples were taken, analysed, sometimes transfused into another, to see if resistance could be passed along. Typhus in particular was a nightmare. The disease spread quickly in camps, carried by lice, bringing fevers so high they cooked the body from within. Doctors didn't just wait for outbreaks, they created them deliberately, infecting groups of prisoners to test vaccines and treatments. Some were given injections that were supposed to protect them, others were left as controls. When the fever swept through, the difference between life and death became another entry in the data. The search for the perfect soldier wasn't about kindness or healing. It was about turning survival into strategy. Could a soldier keep fighting after drinking seawater? Could he march through snow with less risk of frostbite? Could he withstand poison gas long enough to shoot back? Each experiment in the camps was designed to answer those questions, using prisoners as disposable prototypes. Seawater became its own obsession. Naval battles meant men stranded in rafts, waiting for rescue, dying of thirst while surrounded by an ocean they couldn't drink. The Reich wanted to know, was there a way to make seawater safe? Could it be filtered, distilled, treated in some way to sustain life? In the laboratories, prisoners were given nothing but seawater to drink, sometimes treated with chemicals, sometimes not. They wasted away in days, their tongues swollen, their organs shutting down, their bodies desiccated from within. Notes were taken meticulously, every hour, every symptom. The conclusion was obvious. Seawater could not be made safe in that way. But the experiment went on anyway, repeated again and again, as if enough suffering would eventually change the outcome. The dream of the perfect soldier grew even more grotesque when sterilization entered the picture. If a soldier could be hardened, enemies could be weakened. The Reich believed that whole populations could be neutralized not with bullets, but with procedures that robbed them of the ability to reproduce. In the camps, doctors experimented with chemical sterilizations, injections, surgeries, radiation, all designed to end fertility quickly and cheaply. The same prisoners who were used as test subjects for gas and germs now became material for procedures meant to erase entire lineages. It was medical genocide disguised as research, efficiency replacing morality at every step. What strikes you when you imagine this world is how ordinary the settings looked. A barrack with beds against the wall. A room with glass jars and a table. Instruments that could have belonged to any doctor, any clinic, anywhere. But in these hands, in this system, they became tools of war, not healing. The quest for the perfect soldier wasn't about building resilience through training or equipment. It was about treating bodies like raw material, moulding them with gas and germs until they broke, and discarding them when they did. For the prisoners, each new day was another layer of dread. You didn't need to understand the ideology to know what was happening. You only needed to feel the burn in your lungs, the ache in your bones, the fever that shook your body while men in white coats watched impassively. You only needed to hear the sound of another cage of mosquitoes being brought into the room, or see the glint of liquid in a syringe to know you were part of an experiment that was never meant to save you. The soldier imagined by the Reich never existed. No man could be made invulnerable to frost or poison or disease. The experiments didn't create a perfect fighter. They created endless suffering and mountains of data that meant little in the end. But the idea itself was powerful enough to justify the cruelty. The fantasy of invincibility gave permission to turn human beings into test animals, to write notes in clean handwriting while they died on dirty floors, and so the laboratories kept running. Gas chambers not just for killing, but for testing. Germs not just as outbreaks, but as weapons. Hunger not just as punishment, but as a measured trial. Every question about war turned into a question for the prisoners, and every answer came at the cost of another life. The search for the perfect soldier was never about perfection at all. It was about control, about power, about proving that the body itself could be shaped into a weapon, even if thousands had to be broken along the way. The footsteps in the hall never stopped. The clipboards never ran out of paper. And somewhere, a man in uniform smiled, convinced that suffering was progress, that gas and germs could make an army stronger, while the reality was nothing more than another row of bodies carried out behind the laboratory. The mornings began without sunlight. You didn't need the sky to tell you when to wake. Guards with rifles did that for you, or the slam of doors, or the sound of boots coming down the corridor. The camps weren't farms or factories, but they ran like both. Every movement timed, every task calculated, every body expected to be used until it broke. If you were unlucky enough to be part of the experiments, your day didn't belong to you. It belonged to the men with clipboards who decided when you ate, when you stood, when you sat, when you screamed. Daily life in a laboratory disguised as a camp wasn't a life at all, but it had a rhythm. You woke stiff, cold, and sore from the plank you slept on, or from the straw that scratched against your skin, crawling with lice that never left. The first sound you often heard was coughing, deep and rattling, from someone already sick. There was always someone sick. Typhus, tuberculosis, dysentery, infections that spread without effort in rooms packed too tightly, with air too thin, with sanitation that never existed. You tried not to breathe too deeply, as if shallow breaths could protect you from invisible enemies waiting in every corner. Food, if it could be called that, came in ladles. A watery soup, thin enough to see the bottom of the bowl, sometimes with a few scraps of vegetables, sometimes with nothing but grey liquid. A slice of bread hard enough to chip a tooth. If you were part of an experiment, sometimes even that was withheld, because hunger itself was a trial. Doctors wanted to know how long a man could live without nourishment, how the body consumed itself, how strength slipped away. The results were written down in numbers. The feeling was written in your bones. After the ladles were emptied, the day divided. Some prisoners were marched to labour outside the laboratory walls, carrying stones, digging trenches, building barracks. Others were pulled aside, chosen for tests. That choice came without explanation. A gesture, a call of your number, and suddenly you were being led into a different block, where the air smelled not of sweat and rot, but of disinfectant and chemicals. The walls were clean in those rooms, the floors scrubbed, but the sterility was worse than the filth. It meant something clinical was about to happen, something detached, something that would turn your body into a subject, while the men watching pretended it was just another routine. Waiting was its own torment. Sometimes you were told to strip and sit on a bench until the doctors were ready. Nakedness wasn't just exposure, it was erasure. You weren't a person in those moments. You were an object, a specimen, something to be handled and disposed of. The cold air bit at your skin, and you shivered not just from temperature, but from the eyes on you, calculating, measuring, uninterested in who you had been before this room. The experiments came in waves. One day it might be injections, liquids that burned as they entered your veins, leaving your arms swollen, your chest heavy, your stomach twisting. The next, it might be a freezing bath, a tub filled with ice water where you were submerged while a stopwatch ticked. You gasped, you thrashed, you pleaded, but the men in coats didn't flinch. They recorded the time it took for your body temperature to fall, for shivering to stop, for consciousness to fade. Another day it might be a cage of mosquitoes released onto your bare skin, the bites swelling until fever followed, and you became a living chart of malaria's progress. Every detail of your suffering was noted. Pulse rates, breathing, reactions, how quickly the body turned blue, how long it took for blisters to form, how much seawater you drank before you stopped swallowing. The notebooks filled, and you emptied. That was the trade. Between the tests, there was silence. Not rest, just silence. You sat in corners, waiting for the next call, feeling your body ache in ways that didn't heal. The food never came in enough quantity to repair the damage, and the water was often rationed or deliberately contaminated. You felt weaker each day, not just from hunger, but from the knowledge that weakness itself was being studied. To the men in charge, your exhaustion was interesting. Your decline was data. There was no privacy. Even illness wasn't your own. If you vomited, if you coughed blood, if you collapsed, someone was watching. Sometimes another prisoner was forced to clean up after you. Sometimes a guard dragged you out by the arms. Sometimes you were simply left where you fell until you could move again. The line between life and death blurred, because neither mattered much to the laboratory. What mattered was the experiment, and once that was over, so were you. Nights weren't an escape. The lights dimmed, but rarely went out. You lay back on the plank or the straw, your body trembling, your skin itching, your stomach cramping. Around you, men and women groaned in their sleep. Children whimpered. Coughs echoed through the barracks like a chorus. The air was thick with sweat and sickness, and you turned your face into your arm just to avoid the smell. Dreams, when they came, were not relief. They were filled with corridors, syringes, faces bending over you with masks and gloves. You woke already tired, already afraid, already waiting for the next set of footsteps to begin it all again. The cruelty of daily life in these laboratories wasn't only the experiments, it was the monotony, the endless repetition of hunger, cold, waiting, pain, silence. You stopped marking time in days and started marking it in experiments. You remembered yesterday not because it was Tuesday, but because that was the day of the injections. Tomorrow wasn't Wednesday. Tomorrow was the freezing bath. Time itself bent around the rhythm of the tests, and the outside world ceased to exist. Sometimes prisoners were forced to help. One man might be ordered to hold another down while a procedure was carried out. A woman might be forced to fetch water for a tub that would be used for drowning, not bathing. They had no choice, and afterward the guilt was as heavy as the fear. The camp made victims complicit in their own destruction, using survival as a lever to make them part of the machinery. The laboratories weren't hidden from the rest of the camp. Everyone knew what happened there, even if they weren't chosen. Rumours spread, whispered in the dark, about men who went in and never came out, about children with strange marks on their skin, about twins who vanished overnight. Fear became part of the daily air. Even those not directly involved carried the weight of the knowledge, because in a place where death was everywhere, the laboratories carried a special dread. They weren't quick, they weren't anonymous, They were systematic. There were moments that stood out, flashes in the routine. A prisoner collapsing during a march, dragged away and never seen again. A child separated from a parent at the door, led into the clean white room with promises that meant nothing. A guard laughing as a man tried to crawl out of an icy bath, only to be pushed back under. These moments burned into memory, not because they were unusual, but because they were too common, and yet too unbearable to forget. And through it all, the scientists kept their distance. They didn't shout, they didn't rage, they didn't revel like sadists in cartoons. They observed calmly, wrote notes neatly, adjusted their glasses. That was the real horror. The cruelty wasn't chaotic. It was organised, methodical, routine. It was built into the structure of daily life, so deeply that even the screams sounded ordinary after a while. When you imagine daily life inside these laboratories, you might picture chaos and frenzy, but the truth is more numbing. It was silence, repetition, paperwork, cold air, and the steady erosion of human dignity. It was waking each morning knowing you were not waking for yourself, but for someone else's experiment. It was eating food that didn't nourish, drinking water that didn't heal, waiting for a pain you couldn't predict. It was realizing that the laboratory didn't stop at the edge of the room with glass jars. The entire camp was the laboratory. Every barrack, every corridor, every body inside it, part of the machinery of testing and death. And when the day ended, if it ended, you lay back on the straw, staring at the ceiling, too exhausted to think, too hungry to sleep, too frightened to hope. The guard's footsteps faded. The scientist's coats disappeared into the night. But the experiments didn't end. They lingered in your body, in your fever, in your scars, in the ache that spread through your bones. Tomorrow would come without morning, without sunlight, without choice. Another ladle of soup, another clipboard, another test, another day in a place where daily life was designed not to be lived, but to be endured. The guards didn't need guns to control you all the time. Sometimes the deadliest threats in the camp were smaller than your fingernail, things you couldn't even swat away without getting punished. You already knew what it was like to share your bed with lice, to scratch until your skin bled, to feel them crawling through your hair at night. But in the laboratories, insects weren't just a nuisance. They were instruments. They were part of the experiments, weaponized on purpose, raised in cages and boxes, unleashed in ways you couldn't escape. The men in coats had realized something armies had known for centuries. Disease killed more soldiers than bullets ever could. And if you could control the insects that carried disease, you could control life itself. Fleas were the first enemy. Carriers of plague, they had been killing humans for centuries without needing help. The Black Death had rolled across Europe in waves, spread by the bites of fleas, hitching rides on rats. In the Reich's laboratories, those memories weren't nightmares. They were inspiration. If fleas could wipe out half a continent without planning, what might they do in a war if directed carefully? So fleas were collected, bred, and studied, not as pests to eliminate, but as tools to unleash. Imagine sitting in a room, ordered to roll up your sleeve, while a small wooden box was strapped to your arm. Inside, the box was filled with fleas, hungry and restless, separated from you by a thin mesh. The scientists wanted to see how quickly they fed, how long before they spread infection, how many bites it took before fever began. You could feel them moving against your skin, their tiny legs scrambling, their bites sharp and fast. You couldn't brush them away. You couldn't even flinch too much. Or the guard would tighten the strap and hold your arm steady. Every bite was a question being asked by the men with notebooks, and every fever that followed was the answer. Rats were next. The camps were already full of them, feeding on scraps, slipping through cracks in the walls, gnawing at bread and corpses alike. To the prisoners, rats were a daily reminder of filth and hunger. To the scientists, they were a perfect delivery system. Infected rats were kept in cages, their fleas fattened and restless, and then released in controlled environments. Prisoners were forced to sit in those rooms, waiting, as the rats scurried over their bare feet, carrying disease on their backs. Typhus, plague, other infections that didn't need much help to spread. The doctors stood behind glass, watching as fevers rose, as coughs racked thin bodies, as rashes spread across skin. Typhus in particular was the obsession. It had torn through armies before, thinning the ranks faster than enemy fire. It spread easily in cramped, filthy spaces, which meant the camps themselves were perfect laboratories. Lice carried it, and lice were everywhere, crawling in clothing, in blankets, in hair. Prisoners were deliberately infected, sometimes by being placed in lice-infested garments, sometimes by injections of infected blood. The fever began with chills, then burning heat, delirium, confusion, rashes blooming across the body like maps of decay. Doctors timed every stage, measuring not the suffering, but the progression of the disease. To the Reich, the goal was twofold: protect their soldiers and use the disease against enemies. A vaccine that worked would make the German army invulnerable. A weaponized version could devastate entire cities. The men in coats spoke calmly about strategy, while the people in the beds shook with fever, drifting in and out of consciousness until silence claimed them. To the doctors, silence was just another data point. To the prisoners, it was the end. Daily life with insects wasn't limited to the experiments themselves. Even outside the laboratory rooms, lice and fleas were constant. The barracks crawled with them, straw bedding alive with movement. You scratched until your skin was raw, then scratched again. Infection spread from the wounds, but no one cared. It was part of camp life and part of the experiments. Every itch reminded you that you weren't free even in sleep. Your body wasn't yours. It belonged to whatever parasite chose to feed on it next. Plague was more than history here. The scientists kept cultures of bacteria in jars, samples ready to be tested, to be spread. The thought that century-old terror could be bottled and unleashed wasn't frightening to them. It was fascinating. They wanted to know how quickly it would spread, how deadly it would be in controlled conditions, whether it could still sweep through populations the way it had in the 14th century. Prisoners were the proof. They were infected, their symptoms recorded, their deaths charted as progress. Sometimes the experiments didn't even require direct infection. Prisoners were simply placed in filthy, infested conditions and left there. The scientists wanted to see how long it took before disease spread naturally, how fast lice moved from one body to another, how fleas multiplied in bedding and clothing. The misery that came with it wasn't an accident, it was the point. Every cough, every chill, every blistering fever was part of the study. There was a strange cruelty in how small the killers were. You could see a guard's rifle, you could see a whip. You could brace yourself against the blow, but you couldn't see the bacteria crawling into your blood through the bite of a flea. You couldn't fight a mosquito landing on your arm. You couldn't resist the itch, that turned into a fever that turned into delirium. The tiniest creatures in the camp carried the heaviest weight, and the laboratories made sure of it. Prisoners sometimes whispered about the experiments in the dark, describing boxes of lice strapped to their bodies, rooms filled with rats, cages of mosquitoes buzzing in the corners. They whispered about fevers that cooked a man alive in his bunk, about children scratching themselves bloody, about the way guards laughed when someone begged to be allowed to scratch their scalp. The whispers travelled from barrack to barrack, adding another layer of fear to nights already thick with dread. The doctors didn't think of it as cruelty. They thought of it as efficiency. Nature had already created the perfect killers, they reasoned. All they had to do was guide them. If an insect could carry a disease across a battlefield faster than a bullet, then why not use it? If a flea could kill silently, why not breed more? The logic was smooth, cold, easy to write in reports. The reality was thousands of prisoners reduced to fever, delirium, and graves dug shallow because there wasn't time for anything else. To live in those laboratories was to know that your worst enemy might not be a guard, or a doctor, or even starvation. It might be something so small you could crush it between your fingers, if only you were allowed to move. And so daily life became a balance between scratching at bites, coughing from fevers, and waiting for the next test. Sometimes the insects were released deliberately, sometimes they were just part of the environment, but the result was the same. Disease spread, bodies weakened, death followed, and notebooks filled with the details. The laboratory didn't need steel machines or grand inventions. It only needed fleas, rats, and plagues, and the willingness to treat people as nothing more than hosts for them. The footsteps in the hall still came, the clipboard still scratched, but often the experiments didn't need them. The real killers were already inside the barracks, crawling over the straw, biting in the dark, multiplying without effort. You could try to ignore the guards, to hide from the doctors, but you could never hide from the insects. They were part of you, part of the camp, part of the experiments. Every itch was a reminder that you were already part of the study, even when you didn't want to be. The air in the camp was already cold enough to bite, but the laboratories wanted more than nature could provide. They wanted control over the cold, a way to measure it, to bottle it, to unleash it on human bodies until they understood every stage of what it did. Winter on the Eastern Front had chewed up German soldiers by the tens of thousands. Frostbite, hypothermia, exposure. Men collapsed not from bullets, but from snow, from ice, from nights spent in temperatures no one was prepared to endure. And so the doctors in their coats promised the generals an answer. They would test the cold, they would chart its progress, they would find ways to protect soldiers against it. The solution, of course, would not come from volunteers. It would come from prisoners who had no choice. The methods were brutally simple. A prisoner was stripped of clothing and submerged in a tank of icy water, sometimes with chunks of ice floating around their body. The stopwatch clicked as soon as their skin touched the surface. The scientist leaned in close to observe, making notes as the body shivered violently, as breath came in short gasps, as teeth chattered uncontrollably. The first stage was always the same: shock, panic, violent thrashing. After a few minutes, the shivering slowed, the body stiffened, movements became sluggish. Speech turned into stammers, then silence. The skin flushed red, then turned pale, then blue. fingers curled into claws, muscles spasmed, eyes glazed over. Doctors recorded every detail. How long until the pulse weakened? How long until breathing became shallow? How long until a body stopped responding altogether? They weren't guessing. They were timing it, watching the cold shut down human life step by step. Sometimes they pulled the prisoner out just before death, trying different methods of rewarming. Sometimes they waited until silence fell completely, then carried the body away and noted the time of death like it was a statistic, not a life. The experiments weren't limited to water. Men were left outside, stripped naked, forced to lie in the snow under the open sky. Guards poured cold water over them to speed the freezing. Others were strapped down, unable to curl up for warmth, unable to move at all, left as the night air turned their bodies rigid. The doctors walked among them with lanterns, checking pulses, shining lights into eyes, making sure the data was accurate. It was a clinical kind of cruelty, detached, as if freezing a human being alive was just another task on the day's schedule. Rewarming was part of the obsession. How do you bring a frozen soldier back? Could you save a man half dead from hypothermia? Different methods were tried, each one tested on prisoners who couldn't walk away. Sometimes they were placed under blankets with hot water bottles. Sometimes they were put near stoves or fires, their stiff limbs turned like logs. Sometimes boiling water was poured over their bodies, blistering skin already damaged by frost. And sometimes women prisoners were forced to lie against frozen men. Body heat used as an experiment. Intimacy reduced to a test ordered by a clipboard. None of these methods guaranteed survival. Many subjects died in the process. Those who lived were often left crippled, their bodies permanently damaged, their nerves destroyed, but the notes filled up regardless. Inside the barracks, everyone knew what the freezing block meant. If your number was called, if you were taken into that part of the laboratory, you might never come back. Or you might return carried by others, shaking violently, lips blue, skin mottled, unable to speak. Some staggered back, barely alive, their eyes hollow, their bodies weak, only to be called again later for another round. You couldn't hide from the cold. It was waiting in the tanks, in the snow outside, in the air itself. For the prisoners, the cruelty of the freezing wasn't just the pain. It was the humiliation of being treated like material, of hearing doctors calmly discuss your condition as if you were already dead, as if your body was nothing more than a chart of numbers. You could feel the cold sinking into your bones, and you knew they were not watching you as a person, but as an object, a test subject, something to study and discard. Your suffering was invisible to them, even as they recorded every twitch of your limbs. The irony was bitter. The Reich wanted soldiers who could survive the Russian winter, but the experiments produced little useful knowledge. The data was inconsistent, the methods cruel, the results tainted by suffering that made the science sloppy. What they did prove, beyond any doubt, was how fast the cold could kill, how helpless the body was against it, how even the strongest man could be broken by ice and time. The doctors may have thought they were building resilience, but what they built instead was a library of agony, every page soaked with lives that ended in silence. The cold left its mark, even on those who didn't die in the experiments. Prisoners who survived were left with frostbite, blackened fingers and toes, skin that never healed properly, limbs that stiffened and refused to move. They walked with limps. They carried wounds that never closed. They bore scars that burned when the wind shifted. And still, they were counted as survivors, as proof that the experiment could continue. Their broken bodies were considered successes because they hadn't died yet. In the dark, prisoners whispered about the freezing rooms. They spoke of the screams that turned into silence, of the sound of splashing water followed by nothing, of the smell of damp bodies carried out on stretchers. They spoke of the doctors who stood with stopwatches, as if human life could be measured in minutes, as if every death was just another result. The whispers spread, adding another layer of dread to the nights when the cold crept into every corner of the camp. What made it unbearable wasn't only the cruelty of the experiments, but the normalcy of the routine. The tanks were cleaned, the stopwatches reset, the notes filed neatly in cabinets. The next day, it began again. There was no pause, no reflection, no sense of horror from the men in coats. To them, it was work. To the prisoners, it was terror. The gap between those perspectives was wide enough to swallow lives whole, and it did, every day. If you lay on one of those tables, shivering uncontrollably, you felt the cold not just on your skin, but inside your chest, in your bones, in your thoughts. You felt yourself fading, slipping further away with each minute. You tried to cling to something, a memory, a prayer, a fragment of warmth. But the cold erased it all, one layer at a time. And when your body finally stopped fighting, when your shivering stilled and your breathing slowed, the men with the clipboards leaned in, wrote down the time, and prepared for the next subject. The cold didn't need to shout. It whispered steadily through every frozen lung, every stiffened limb, every silent death. And the laboratories listened carefully, as if the sound of a body shutting down was the answer to a question worth asking. The smell reached you before the pain did. Sharp, chemical, acrid, something that clawed at the back of your throat and made your eyes water before you even understood what was happening. The laboratories didn't stop with freezing water or cages of fleas. They also turned to gas, the invisible killer that haunted memories of the last World War. The Great War had left whole battlefields choked in clouds of poison, men stumbling blind, coughing out their lungs in trenches already soaked with blood. The Reich remembered, and it wanted to be ready if gas returned. Ready didn't mean building better masks alone. It meant testing the gas directly on human bodies, measuring what it did in every stage, and pretending the suffering was a kind of progress. Mustard gas was one of the favourites. It didn't kill instantly, which made it useful for study. It crept into the skin, into the lungs, burning slowly, peeling layers of flesh from bone, turning breath into fire. In the laboratories, prisoners were exposed in controlled amounts. Sometimes it was a chamber filled with the faint haze of the chemical, enough to sting the throat and force coughing fits that doubled men over. Sometimes it was direct application, droplets smeared onto skin, measured carefully to see how long it took before blisters rose. The scientists timed everything. How many minutes until redness appeared? How many hours before swelling made limbs unrecognizable? How many days until the burns ate through to deeper tissue? The gas left scars that didn't fade. Skin bubbled and split, yellow fluid seeping from wounds that refused to close. Eyes clouded, throat swelled, breathing became a slow drowning. Those exposed to larger doses collapsed quickly, choking, clawing at their necks as if air itself had betrayed them. The doctors watched, sometimes offering antidotes, sometimes withholding them, comparing the results like farmers checking crops. If a treatment slowed the burns, it was noted. If it failed, the subject was left to die, another number in a notebook. There was a strange cruelty in how methodical it all was. A guard held down an arm. A doctor dabbed a cotton swab soaked in the chemical. A stopwatch ticked on a desk. The prisoner flinched, cried out, thrashed. Another assistant steadied them. The skin reddened, then blistered, then split. The notebook filled with observations. Onset of blistering at 25 minutes, pus discharge at 3 hours, necrosis spreading by day 2. The human agony was translated into sterile language, as if calling it necrosis erased the screams. The lungs suffered differently. Inhalation meant coughing that tore at the chest, phlegm laced with blood, airways swollen until breathing became impossible. Some prisoners gasped for hours before silence came, their chests rising weakly, their lips blue. Others lasted days, each breath a rattle, each attempt at speech a wheeze. Doctors stood nearby, listening, timing, recording. To them, the sound of drowning on dry land was a data point. To the prisoner, it was death by suffocation disguised as research. The irony again was that the results gave little of value. Treatments were crude, antidotes inconsistent, protective measures already known. The experiments didn't lead to breakthroughs that saved soldiers. They led only to rows of bodies carried out of chambers, their skin sloughing off, their lungs destroyed. Yet the tests continued, because the Reich believed every possibility had to be explored, no matter the cost to those forced into the trials. Daily life around the mustard gas rooms carried its own dread. Prisoners whispered about the smell, about the coughing fits that echoed down the corridors, about the way men returned with faces swollen beyond recognition, their eyes sealed shut with pus, their skin covered in blisters that oozed and cracked. Some came back unable to walk, carried by others, their feet burned raw. Some never came back at all. Everyone knew the signs. The sharp chemical odour that clung to clothing, the rasp in someone's breathing that never faded, the blisters spreading across arms like maps of pain. You didn't need to see the chamber to know it was there. You could hear it in the coughing, smell it in the air, feel it in the silence when another bed lay empty. The cruelty of the mustard gas trials wasn't only in the exposure, it was in the repetition. The same procedure performed again and again, as if one man's agony wasn't enough proof. Dozens exposed, dozens measured, dozens discarded, all to confirm what the first victim had already shown. That mustard gas burned, that it suffocated, that it destroyed. The doctors didn't stop because the answer was already known. They kept going because the system demanded data, more data, endless data, as if pages of notes could turn suffering into science. If you were one of the subjects, you felt it first as a sting, then as fire spreading across your skin, then as waves of pain that made you wish the cold tanks had been your fate instead. The burns didn't heal. They grew. They deepened. They rotted. Infection set in quickly, because there was no medicine, no antibiotics, no clean bandages. The wounds festered, attracting flies, oozing fluid that soaked into clothing, into bedding, into straw that was never changed. Sleep was impossible. Every movement tore the wounds wider. Every breath scraped the lungs raw. And all the while, the men with clipboards kept writing, fascinated by the details of how long it took for a body to break. Sometimes they tried treatments not to save you, but to see if they could prolong your suffering for further observation. Salves, rinses, powders, each applied in a different amounts, compared carefully. Did it slow the blistering? Did it reduce the swelling? Did it change the way the lungs fill with fluid? If it failed, you were left to die anyway. If it worked a little, you might be kept alive longer, used again for another round. Survival didn't mean freedom. It meant more experiments. The gas chambers themselves were simple rooms. Not the killing chambers used elsewhere, but clinical spaces with vents, pipes, jars of chemicals stacked neatly on shelves. Guards stood at the doors, doctors inside with masks and gloves. The air inside was invisible, but it carried death in every breath. And when the session ended, the room was scrubbed down, the instruments cleaned, the notes filed, ready for the next round. Nothing about it looked monstrous. That was the horror. It looked ordinary. Just another workspace. Just another day's labour. Just another experiment in a long line of them. The prisoners knew better. They knew the gas didn't care who you were, what you believed, what you hoped for. It only cared about flesh, about lungs, about the chance to burn and suffocate. And the doctors didn't care either. To them, your suffering was invisible behind the numbers they scribbled down. You weren't a man or a woman, a child or a parent. You were exposure time, blister diameter, hours until death. The notebooks filled, the bodies emptied, and the experiments went on. The smell lingered long after the sessions ended. It clung to the walls, to the clothing of guards, to the very air in the corridor. Prisoners passing by coughed, eyes watering, even without stepping inside. The gas didn't need much to leave its mark. A drop on the skin, a breath in the lungs, and the body betrayed itself, peeling, blistering, drowning. And while the men in coats recorded it all calmly, the prisoners whispered in the dark, scratching at bites, shivering from fever, waiting for their turn in the gas rooms, knowing they would never walk out whole again. The buzzing came first. High-pitched, faint at a distance, impossible to ignore once it was close. In the camp, you were already used to insects. Lice in your bedding, fleas on your body, rats crawling at your feet. But mosquitoes were something different. You didn't just itch when they bit. You burned. You shook. You sweated until your clothes clung to you. And then you froze, shivering in waves that felt endless. Malaria wasn't new to the world, but in the laboratories it was reshaped into a tool, a weapon delivered by wings smaller than a fingernail. The Reich was fighting on fronts where swamps and rivers carried more danger than bullets. Malaria had always been the invisible enemy of armies, thinning their numbers, leaving men weak and delirious, easy targets for anyone still standing. The doctors in their coats promised to find ways to stop it. They didn't test on soldiers. They tested on prisoners who never had a choice, who were marched into rooms where cages lined the walls, each one vibrating with the whine of mosquitoes desperate for blood. The procedure was simple. A guard opened the cage, and suddenly the room filled with movement, black dots swarming, landing on bare arms, on legs, on faces. You couldn't swat them. You couldn't move. You sat still while dozens, sometimes hundreds, pierced your skin, sucking blood and leaving disease behind. First it was only bites, swelling, itching, red welts blooming across your body. Then came the fever, heat so intense it felt like fire under your skin, followed by chills so violent your teeth rattled in your skull. Sweat poured down your face, soaking the straw beneath you. Then came another wave, cold that sank into your bones, shaking that left you too weak to sit upright. The cycle repeated. Fever, chills, exhaustion, until you could no longer tell what time it was, whether it was day or night. The doctor stood nearby, observing calmly, writing notes about how many bites had landed, how long it took for symptoms to begin, how severe the fevers were, how quickly strength vanished. They didn't see a man shaking violently on a bench. They saw data points on a page, proof that malaria could be studied in real time. Sometimes the mosquitoes weren't released into rooms. Sometimes small boxes filled with them were strapped to prisoners' arms or legs. The insects trapped inside with no escape except through the thin mesh pressed against skin. You felt them crawling, biting, feeding. You felt the swelling start as their bellies filled with your blood. The longer the box stayed, the more bites you carried, the higher your chance of fever. The scientists compared results. One prisoner with 10 bites, another with 50, another with 100. Each body became a number, each fever a measurement. The disease didn't kill quickly, which made it useful. The doctors could watch the stages unfold over days, even weeks. They noted the yellowing of eyes, the enlargement of spleens, the weakness that turned strong men into husks. Blood samples were drawn daily, sometimes multiple times a day, until veins collapsed. Sometimes blood from one infected prisoner was injected into another, to study whether immunity could be transferred, or whether the disease could spread faster. Needles pierced again and again, until arms were bruised, swollen, useless. The experiments didn't end when the fever peaked. Treatments were tested too: quinine, atabrine, other drugs. Some were given in measured doses, others withheld entirely. One group received medicine, another didn't. If the fever broke, notes were taken. If the fever didn't, if delirium turned into coma, if breathing slowed until it stopped, that was written down too. Survival or death wasn't the goal. The goal was data, and malaria provided it in abundance. Prisoners whispered about the mosquito rooms the way they whispered about the freezing tanks and the gas chambers. The sound of buzzing became enough to spark fear. Even at night, lying on straw, you imagined it. That thin whine circling your head, waiting for a place to land. The experiments blurred into the environment. The line between the natural infestations of the camp and the deliberate releases of the laboratory disappeared. Every bite carried dread. Every fever a question you couldn't answer. Was this just a camp? Or was this an experiment? Either way, the result was the same. You shook, you sweated, you wasted away, while men with notebooks stood nearby, pretending it was science. The cruelty was sharpened by the fact that malaria was preventable, treatable, already understood in much of the world. But in these rooms, prevention was never the goal. Protection for prisoners wasn't considered. They were deliberately exposed, deliberately infected, deliberately left to suffer. The disease was not an accident of environment. It was a weapon in the hands of the Reich, tested over and over on bodies that had no chance of fighting back. You could hear the aftermath in the barracks. Men groaning in the night, their bodies slick with sweat, shaking uncontrollably. Women too weak to rise from their planks. Children crying in fever, dreams they couldn't escape. The sound of delirium filled the air, muttered words that made no sense, pleas for water, for relief, for mercy that never came. The guards ignored it. The doctors recorded it. The rest of the prisoners tried not to listen. knowing their turn could come next. The mosquitoes didn't need uniforms, didn't need orders, didn't need weapons. They were the perfect soldiers for the Reich's laboratories. Silent, tireless, lethal. Released at night, they swarmed without hesitation, delivering disease in every bite, leaving prisoners trembling in fevers that stretched on for days. And in the end, when the fever finally burned too hot, when the body stopped shaking and lay still, another set of notes was filed, another page filled, another experiment completed. The buzzing faded only when the cages were empty. The silence afterward wasn't peace. It was just a pause before the next round, before another group of prisoners was led into the room, before another wave of mosquitoes was released like weapons of the night. Disease was already everywhere. The camps didn't need help spreading sickness. Overcrowded barracks, lice in the straw, no clean water, no sanitation. People coughed until their lungs bled. Fevers burned unchecked. Diarrhea left bodies so weak they could barely sit upright. But the laboratories weren't satisfied with what nature provided. They wanted more. They wanted controlled outbreaks, measurable epidemics, infections that could be timed and recorded. They wanted to manufacture plagues on purpose. Tuberculosis was one of the most devastating. It had haunted Europe for centuries, called consumption for the way it slowly devoured a body from the inside. In the camps, tuberculosis spread naturally through the crowded barracks, but the doctors in uniform didn't just observe it, they cultivated it. Cultures of the bacteria were prepared in jars, injected into prisoners' lungs, smeared onto their skin, forced into their bloodstreams. They wanted to watch the disease develop stage by stage, not as a tragedy, but as an experiment. The results were as brutal as they were predictable. Prisoners coughed until their ribs ached, coughing up blood into rags that never got washed, their lungs filling with fluid, their breathing ragged and wheezing. Weight melted away, faces hollowed, eyes sank deep into skulls. Tuberculosis was a slow killer, but in the laboratories, that slowness was part of the interest. Doctors recorded how long it took for the cough to start, how many days until blood appeared, how many weeks until the body collapsed completely. Some were left untreated to watch the natural progression. Others were given experimental drugs, often in doses too small to work, just to compare outcomes. Either way, the ending was usually the same: silence, followed by a line in a notebook. Typhus was different. It was faster, fiercer, and perfectly suited for the kind of epidemic the Reich wanted to study. Carried by lice, it spread with terrifying speed in conditions like the camps. Fevers soared to 40 degrees. Rashes spread like maps of fire across the body. Delirium took over, and death often came within weeks. The Nazis saw typhus both as a threat and as an opportunity. A threat because it could weaken their own soldiers on the front. An opportunity because it could be turned into a weapon against enemies. A plague deliberately unleashed. To test it, outbreaks were engineered. Prisoners were injected with infected blood or forced into clothing infested with lice carrying the disease. Entire groups were deliberately exposed, left together in cramped rooms to see how quickly the infection spread. Vaccines were tested, one group injected, another left as control, and then both were thrown into the middle of an outbreak. The difference between fever and survival became a number in a table, a piece of data for the Reich's scientists. The cruelty of typhus wasn't just the fever. It was the delirium that stripped away identity, leaving men and women muttering nonsense, crying out for people who weren't there, thrashing on planks until their bodies gave out. The rashes spread until skin seemed to burn from the inside. The heart pounded itself to exhaustion. The brain swelled with heat. And through it all, doctors stood by with clipboards, recording every stage as if it were just another performance. Prisoners spoke in whispers about being led into the typhus blocks, about rooms so thick with sickness you could feel it in the air, about lice crawling visibly on the walls, falling from blankets, biting endlessly. Once you were inside, escape was impossible. Even if you survived the fever, your body was ruined, emaciated, scarred, weak, barely capable of walking. Survival wasn't freedom. It was just another mark in a ledger proving the experiment had worked. The epidemics were controlled but also careless. Once unleashed, diseases didn't respect boundaries. They spread beyond the experimental groups, sweeping through barracks, infecting guards, even reaching the doctors themselves. Vaccines and treatments were tested frantically, but always on prisoners first. Death piled up faster than results. Bodies stacked outside barracks, burial pits filled, the smell of decay mixing with the sharp tang of disinfectant. The camp itself became a giant laboratory, where life and death blurred into one long, continuous outbreak. The justification was always the same. The Reich needed answers. How could they protect soldiers from tuberculosis in the field? How could they defend against typhus outbreaks in trenches? How could they weaponize these diseases against enemies? The words sounded like strategy, like preparation, but what they really meant was cruelty repeated endlessly, suffering inflicted deliberately. Epidemics created for curiosity and control. If you were one of the test subjects, it didn't feel like science. It felt like drowning in your own body. Every cough rattled your chest like broken glass. Every fever stripped away another piece of your strength. Every bite of a louse carried dread. You lay on your plank, sweating, shaking, delirious, while men in coats leaned over you, checking your pulse, shining lights into your eyes, writing notes while you slipped further into sickness. You weren't a patient. You weren't even a prisoner. You were the epidemic itself, manufactured, observed, and left to burn out. The worst part was the inevitability. You knew what was happening the moment you were chosen. You saw the lice boxes, the needles, the blankets crawling with movement. You heard the coughs in the distance, the moans of men already deep in fever. You knew your turn was coming, and there was no way to stop it. All you could do was wait, counting down the hours until the first chill shook your body, until the first drop of blood hit the straw, until the fever carried you away. And outside the laboratory rooms, the epidemic spread anyway. The camps themselves became perfect breeding grounds, places where sickness was as constant as hunger, where coughs never stopped, where rashes bloomed on every surface. The doctors had their data. The generals had their reports. The prisoners had their graves. And the epidemics went on, manufactured on purpose, sustained by cruelty, measured in silence. The needles never promised relief. In ordinary hospitals, a syringe might mean morphine for pain, or a vaccine against illness, or medicine that carried at least some hope of healing. In the camps, the needle meant something else entirely. It meant an experiment, or it meant death, or both at once. Doctors in white coats spoke of efficiency, of clean endings, of quick solutions to messy problems. The Reich wanted to know if a life could be ended in a moment, not with gas or bullets or starvation, but with a single injection. They wanted death on command, reliable and silent, something that could be carried in a vial, slipped into a vein, and guaranteed to finish the work without effort. The laboratories became factories of poison. Vials lined the shelves, each filled with liquids that looked harmless, clear as water, amber as tea, cloudy as milk. Some were extracted from plants, others brewed in chemical labs, still others derived from animal toxins. Each one was tested on prisoners who didn't get to ask what it was. They were strapped to tables, sleeves rolled up, arms held still. The needle pierced skin, the plunger pressed down, the liquid entered the bloodstream. And then everyone waited to see what would happen. Sometimes death came quickly. A gasp, a tightening of the chest, a collapse into silence within minutes. Doctors nodded, scribbled notes, satisfied that this particular poison worked as promised. Sometimes it took longer, and the suffering became a spectacle. Convulsions shook the body, jaws clenched, eyes bulged, veins stood out against the skin. Foam bubbled from mouths, limbs thrashed against restraints, muscles spasmed until exhaustion set in. Some victims cried out, others gurgled, others fell into silence only after hours of agony. The doctors recorded each stage carefully, not horrified but interested, as if watching a machine break down under stress. Different poisons brought different endings. Some paralysed muscles slowly, leaving the victim conscious but unable to move, trapped inside their own body while breathing failed. Others attacked the heart, causing violent palpitations that ended in sudden stillness. Some burned through veins, leaving streaks of blackened tissue that spread from the injection site outwards, infection racing faster than the body could resist. And some were experimental mixes, combinations of chemicals chosen at random, injected just to see what they would do. Every outcome was data. Every death was a number in a column. Not all of the injections were meant to kill instantly. Some were designed to test the threshold of pain. Prisoners were given sublethal doses that caused seizures, vomiting, delirium, but not death. At least not right away. The doctors wanted to see how long the body could withstand it, whether the suffering itself could reveal something useful. Those left alive were often injected again later, their bodies pushed through repeated waves of agony until organs gave out. Survival was not the point, endurance was. The search for instant death was practical for the Reich. They wanted efficient execution methods for prisoners. They wanted tools for assassinations, for battlefield use, for disposing of people quietly when gas chambers or bullets weren't convenient. A syringe was small, portable, precise. A man could be killed in a barrack, in a hospital bed, even in public, with only a quick prick and a silent collapse. That was the dream. And so, the experiments continued. Endless trials in the pursuit of efficiency. For the prisoners, the terror of injections was constant. Even outside the laboratory, needles were feared. You never knew what was inside the syringe. It could be saline, it could be typhus bacteria, it could be poison. Guards called numbers casually, prisoners lined up, arms were grabbed, and needles slid in without explanation. The silence afterward was the worst. You waited, feeling the liquid burn through your veins, wondering if your heart would stop in minutes, or if the fever would come later, or if nothing would happen at all until tomorrow. Every injection was a coin toss, and the doctors never told you the stakes. The cruelty lay in the indifference. The men in coats didn't rage, didn't gloat, didn't scream. They worked calmly, efficiently, drawing liquids into syringes, injecting arms, making notes. To them, it wasn't murder. It was research. Each body that convulsed and collapsed was just another test case, another line of handwriting in a notebook. They didn't see the humanity. They didn't need to. The numbers were enough. Sometimes the experiments weren't even in laboratories. Infirmaries became execution sites, where sick prisoners were injected under the pretense of treatment. They were told they were being given medicine, a cure, a relief. They relaxed, they trusted, and then they died within minutes. Other times the injections were punishment disguised as science. A prisoner caught stealing food or refusing orders might be taken aside and injected with a poison for study. Justice and experimentation blurred into the same act, and death by syringe became both a method and a message. The bodies carried out afterward told the story more clearly than the notebooks. Lips blue, eyes open, limbs twisted unnaturally, veins blackened at the injection site. Some were stiff already, rigour setting in quickly from the violence of the chemicals. Others looked peaceful, as if sleep had come suddenly. But all were discarded with the same indifference. Another pile for the crematorium. Another line in a report sent to superiors who never cared about the names, only the results. What made it unbearable was how ordinary it seemed to the men conducting it. They wore clean gloves, used sterile instruments, followed procedure. They acted as though they were doing legitimate work, as though the syringes carried progress instead of poison. The line between doctor and executioner disappeared, not with violence or rage, but with quiet, routine injections that left bodies lifeless in minutes. If you were one of the subjects, lying on the table, staring at the ceiling, you didn't need to be told what was happening. You felt it the moment the needle entered your vein. The burning, the tightness in your chest, the sudden weakness spreading through your limbs. You tried to breathe, but the air wouldn't come. You tried to speak, but your mouth only frothed. You heard the scratch of a pen somewhere nearby, calm, steady, disinterested, while your body betrayed you one spasm at a time. And then, when the silence came, the pen stopped too. Another experiment completed. Another vial chosen for the next prisoner. The search for instant death didn't find perfection. It didn't create the flawless poison they imagined. It created only pain, only silence, only notebooks filled with results that would never redeem the cruelty that produced them. But the laboratories didn't care about redemption. They cared about efficiency, and poison delivered it well enough. One syringe, one injection, one less body breathing in the barracks. And so the experiments went on. Vials lined up, needles prepared, prisoners chosen, lives ended with quiet precision. Instant death was never guaranteed, but it was always attempted, always tested, always written down, as if the suffering was proof of progress. And in the end, the syringe became as feared as the gas chamber, as the freezing tank, as the cages of mosquitoes. It was small, silent, efficient, and it carried the weight of death with the push of a plunger. Thirst was already a constant in the camps. Water was rationed, dirty, often scarce. Lips cracked, tongues swelled, every swallow felt like grinding sand. But in the laboratories, thirst was turned into something worse, something calculated. The Reich wanted to know whether men stranded at sea could survive by drinking what surrounded them. Naval battles left sailors adrift in lifeboats, surrounded by endless waves, dying not from hunger, but from the ocean itself. The salt water promised relief, sparkling in the sun, but it was poison in disguise. Drink it, and it strips water from your body, shrivels your cells, drives you into madness and death. The Nazis weren't satisfied with knowing this from centuries of shipwreck stories. They wanted proof, measured in human suffering. So prisoners were chosen, lined up in groups, and denied food and water except for what the doctors gave them. Cups filled with seawater. Sometimes it was taken straight from the ocean, salty and brackish. Other times it was treated with chemicals in attempts to make it safe. The Reich dreamed of a method that could turn the sea into a reservoir for its soldiers. The prisoners became the test subjects for that dream. The first days were the hardest. The salt burned the mouth, blistered the tongue, left throats raw and aching. You swallowed, desperate for relief, and found only more thirst waiting. The liquid sat heavy in the stomach, then pulled water out of the body itself. Urine turned dark, sweat vanished, skin tightened, eyes sunk deeper into sockets. Every movement ached, every breath carried the taste of brine, as if the ocean itself had invaded your veins. Doctors came by with clipboards, recording the stages of dehydration. How long before lips cracked and bled? How long before skin lost elasticity, refusing to spring back when pinched? How long before confusion set in, when prisoners stumbled over words, stared blankly at walls, muttered nonsense as the brain dried out inside the skull? They charted weight loss, pulse changes, organ failure, each symptom another neat line in the delta. Sometimes, to make the cruelty more thorough, prisoners were fed only seawater treated food. Bread soaked in it until it was rubbery, soups cooked with it until they stung the throat. The salt worked its way into every bite, every swallow, until eating and drinking felt the same. Punishment disguised as nourishment. The body, already starved, now carried another burden, trying to survive on fuel that poisoned instead of sustained. The fantasies of the doctors stretched further. They experimented with chemical treatments, adding powders and distillates to the seawater, convinced they could strip the salt away. Prisoners were given these mixtures and told nothing. Some tasted faintly less bitter, others more foul, but all carried the same result. The body weakened, the organs shriveled, the thirst never ended. In some cases, the chemicals themselves caused new problems. Stomach cramps, violent diarrhea, vomiting that left prisoners even more dehydrated than before. The notes, of course, described this as valuable information. Delirium was the final stage. Prisoners began to hallucinate, speaking to people who weren't there, reaching for water that didn't exist, sometimes lapping at puddles on the ground as guards laughed. The doctors wrote this down too, describing the behavioural effects of thirst. When the end came, it was usually quiet. A man too weak to lift his head. A woman slipping into unconsciousness. A child no longer crying, just lying still. The clipboard captured the time of death. The body was carried out. The experiment was considered complete. Everyone in the barracks knew the seawater group. You could tell by the smell of brine on their breath, the cracked and bleeding lips, the sunken eyes. You could tell by the way they moved, slow and weak, stumbling like shadows of themselves. Some prisoners tried to comfort them, smuggling in drops of clean water when guards weren't looking, but it was never enough. The body demanded more than charity could provide, and the guards often punished such kindness, making examples out of those who tried. The irony was cruel, the Reich's scientists had access to knowledge already known to sailors for centuries. Men stranded at sea had written about the horrors of drinking seawater long before the laboratories were built. They had described the same thirst, the same delirium, the same inevitable death. But the Nazis didn't trust history, or didn't care. They wanted their own data, their own proof, their own numbers carved into the suffering of prisoners. The result was the same. Seawater was not salvation. It was death in disguise. But the price of rediscovering what sailors already knew was hundreds of lives wasted in experiments that offered nothing new. The thirst never left, even outside the laboratories. Prisoners who survived were marked by it. Their bodies permanently weakened, kidneys damaged, stomachs scarred. They remembered the taste of brine forever, the way it coated the tongue, the way it left the throat raw. Some spoke later of dreaming about water, rivers, cups, even puddles, only to wake with mouths dry and cracked, the memory of salt still stinging their lips. For those who didn't survive, the end came quietly but cruelly. No dramatic collapse, no sudden violence, just a slow fading, a drying out, a body reduced to little more than brittle skin and bone. The scientists, satisfied with their observations, moved on to the next group, the next experiment, the next fantasy. And the ocean, endless and indifferent, kept rolling against its shores, never drinkable, never merciful, never changing. The prisoners lay in their bunks at night, listening to their own dry breathing, their tongues too swollen to speak. Outside, guards paced, boots crunching against gravel. Somewhere in another block, another experiment was beginning, and in the seawater rooms, cups were filled again, handed out again, forced down throats again, as if the ocean could be tamed by cruelty, as if thirst itself could be conquered by making others die of it first. The body wasn't seen as whole in the laboratories. It was seen as with parts to be cut, compared, rearranged, tested, and discarded. A prisoner lying on a table wasn't a man or a woman, not even a patient. They were bone, they were muscle, they were organs waiting to be taken apart. The Reich wanted answers to questions about healing, about transplantation, about how far the body could be pushed before it collapsed. But the answers weren't sought in hospitals. They were extracted in the camps, where prisoners couldn't refuse, couldn't scream loud enough to stop the scalpel from cutting. The experiments with bones began as attempts to study regeneration. Doctors wanted to know if bones could be removed, fractured, or crushed, and then repaired. They wanted to test methods for grafting, for transplantation, for surgical innovation. But instead of dogs or laboratory animals, they used people. Prisoners were strapped down, limbs pinned in place, and bones surgically removed without anesthesia, or with only the crudest numbing methods. Femurs, tibias, ribs, pieces of skeleton taken as if the body were nothing more than spare parts in a warehouse. The wounds were rarely treated afterward. The incisions were sewn shut clumsily, if at all, an infection set in quickly. Legs swelled, oozing pus, turning black at the edges. Prisoners writhed in agony, unable to walk, unable to move, forced to lie in filth while fever consumed them. Some lingered for days, others for weeks, until sepsis ended them. The doctors didn't intervene. Their interest was in whether the body could repair itself, and when it didn't, they had their answer, and they had another corpse to dissect. Muscle experiments followed the same logic. Tissue was removed deliberately to study regeneration, to see whether grafts could take, whether muscles from one body could be sewn into another. Entire sections of flesh were cut away, leaving deep, raw wounds that never healed properly. Prisoners were left crippled, their strength gone, their movements reduced to limps and shuffles. Some were forced to continue with daily labour, dragging half-ruined limbs through work they could barely manage. The pain was constant, but to the doctors it was irrelevant. The suffering was simply the backdrop to their notes. Organ removal was even worse. Prisoners were used as living dissections. Their bodies opened to study the effects of disease, of poison, of starvation. Livers removed to check for chemical damage. Lungs cut open to examine infection. Stomachs sliced apart to trace the ravages of seawater or gas. Some were killed outright before dissection. Others were operated on while still alive, anesthesia withheld to see how the body responded to trauma in real time. Screams echoed in the sterile rooms, bouncing off tiled walls, but the doctor's hands never wavered. They cut, they examined, they measured, as if pain itself were a kind of data worth recording. Notebooks described it clinically. Specimen expired during procedure. Subject unable to withstand graft. Muscle necrosis observed after excision. The words were neat, detached, hiding the reality of agony, the smell of blood and infection, the sound of begging voices. In the language of science, murder was disguised as progress. The body wasn't killed, it expired. The wound wasn't infected, it showed necrosis. Each death was translated into the cold vocabulary of research, stripping away the humanity one line at a time. Prisoners feared the surgical blocks more than the gas chambers. Gas killed quickly. Surgery did not. Surgery meant being strapped down, conscious, aware, feeling every cut. It meant surviving long enough to live with missing bones, missing muscles, gaping wounds. It meant being returned to the barracks unable to stand, unable to eat, unable to sleep without agony. It meant being used again later if the body held out. For those who didn't die immediately, survival was just a pause before the next round of cutting. The guards treated it as routine. They dragged prisoners into the rooms, held them down during procedures, carried them out afterward. Some laughed at the screams. Some didn't react at all, as if their ears had stopped recognizing pain as something real. The doctors gave orders calmly, choosing instruments, checking their work, writing notes. The laboratory smelled of disinfectant, but underneath it always lingered the odour of blood, of rot, of open flesh. That smell clung to clothing, to hair, to the very walls, impossible to scrub away. Among the prisoners, rumours spread like infections themselves. Stories of men missing whole sections of bone, of women left with stomachs cut open and sewn back poorly, of children dissected without even being given the dignity of anaesthesia. Some of the rumours were true, some were worse. The uncertainty itself was another form of torment. You never knew what was possible until you saw it, until you smelled it, until you heard the screams coming from the surgical block. The Reich justified it all with the language of war. Soldiers injured in battle, they said, might need bone grafts, muscle transplants, organ surgery. These experiments, they claimed, would provide answers that could save lives on the front. But the reality was sloppy, cruel, and scientifically worthless. Wounds became infected not because of battlefield conditions, but because the laboratories deliberately ignored hygiene. Results were inconsistent, data corrupted by suffering that made precision impossible. Nothing useful was discovered. What was discovered, over and over, was how much pain a body could endure before it failed. If you were one of the unlucky chosen, you lay on the table staring at the ceiling, the light too bright, the instruments gleaming on trays nearby. You heard the clink of scalpels, the shuffle of boots, the scratch of pens. You felt the cut before you understood it, the heat of your own blood spreading, the tearing of tissue as hands worked inside you. You screamed, but the hands never stopped. You pleaded, but the notes continued. You faded, and when you were gone, your body was opened again, this time without restraint, dissected fully for whatever was left to learn. The body was not sacred in those rooms. It was raw material. Bone, muscle, organ. Each part removed, measured, catalogued and discarded. And when the next prisoner was dragged in, the process began again. Another body reduced to parts, another experiment in a long line of cruelty that never ended, only paused briefly before continuing. The laboratories weren't always satisfied with ending a life quickly. Sometimes the goal was to end it slowly, not in the present, but in the future. The Reich wasn't content with killing bodies. They wanted to kill generations, to erase lineages, to make sure children would never be born. Sterilization became one of their most disturbing obsessions. They wanted methods that could be efficient, cheap, invisible. They wanted a weapon that didn't fire bullets or drop bombs, but simply made it impossible for whole populations to continue. The camps became the testing ground. Prisoners were chosen at random, men and women both, marched into rooms where they were told little or nothing. The experiments began with surgeries. Women were subjected to operations on their reproductive organs, performed without anesthesia or with crude instruments that left them scarred, bleeding, often infected. Ovaries removed, fallopian tubes cut, wombs mutilated in the name of science. Men were subjected to castration, testicles removed with as much ceremony as trimming a branch from a tree. The wounds festered, the bodies weakened, the dignity was gone. But surgery was only the beginning. Surgery was too slow, too obvious, too resource heavy. The Reich wanted something quicker, something that could be scaled to thousands, even millions. So they turned to chemicals and radiation. Prisoners were lined up, injected with substances into their veins, their wombs, their testicles. Caustic liquids that burned from the inside, destroying tissue, leaving agony in their wake. Some were told they were receiving treatment. Some weren't told anything at all. Hours later, pain spread through their abdomens, fevers rose, infections followed. For many, the injections caused not just sterilization but death. Those who survived were left permanently damaged, scarred internally, unable to bear children. Radiation was another tool. Men and women were strapped into chairs or laid under machines, their reproductive organs exposed to targeted doses of X-rays. The heat seared, the skin blistered, the insides burned silently. They left the room stumbling, nauseous, vomiting, their hair falling out, their strength fading. Days later, fevers and sores appeared. Weeks later, the ability to reproduce was gone. In many cases, life itself was gone soon after. The doctors took notes, recording dosage levels, timing, effects. To them, infertility was a victory. Death was merely collateral data. The cruelty went further. Women were sometimes subjected to forced gynecological procedures, experiments designed not only to sterilize but to humiliate. Vaginal injections of corrosive substances, devices inserted crudely, radiation applied repeatedly. The pain was excruciating, the aftermath unbearable. Infection spread, fevers lingered, some women bled to death. Others survived, but with scars so deep they could never carry a child again. The goal wasn't only physical, it was psychological. It was the destruction of hope, the denial of motherhood, the erasure of future families. Men endured their own tortures. Chemical injections into the testicles left them swollen, blackened, necrotic. Some collapsed screaming, others went silent, unable to move from the pain. Castration was carried out with cold indifference, the organs removed, sometimes preserved in jars, sometimes discarded. The men who lived were left emasculated, broken in spirit as much as in body, reminders of what the Reich intended to erase. The justification was always the same: efficiency. Bullets wasted resources. Gas required infrastructure. Starvation took too long. But sterilization promised something else: the quiet elimination of entire populations. A prisoner sterilized today would not have children tomorrow. A village sterilized in secret would vanish in a generation without the world even noticing. The doctors spoke about it clinically, as if it were nothing more than pest control. They used the language of hygiene, of purification, of progress. But what they were doing was ending bloodlines, cutting off futures, ensuring silence where there should have been voices. In the barracks, prisoners whispered about the sterilization rooms. Men came back limping, holding themselves in agony, silent about what had been done. Women returned pale, bleeding, unable to walk properly, refusing to speak of what had happened. Some didn't come back at all. The rumours spread of radiation machines, of needles, of surgeries performed without warning. Fear spread with them, because sterilization wasn't just about the body. It was about erasing the last, fragile hope that life might continue after the camp. The cruelty lay not only in the act, but in its permanence. Hunger passed. Fevers sometimes broke. Even wounds could heal. But sterilization was final. It marked a prisoner for life, even if they somehow survived the war, even if they walked out of the camp alive. It stole the possibility of children, of families, of rebuilding. It stole the future as effectively as bullets stole the present. And still, the doctors recorded it as progress. Subject rendered infertile after 2 treatments. Radiation dosage sufficient at 180 raids. Chemical injection successful, testes atrophied. The words were cold, the handwriting neat, the conclusions presented as achievements. The bodies left behind told another story. Pain, bleeding, despair, silence. If you were chosen for sterilization, you knew it the moment you entered the room. You saw the instruments, the syringes, the machines. You felt the heat, the sting, the tearing pain inside. You left weaker than you had entered, your body damaged beyond repair. And when you lay back on the straw that night, staring at the ceiling, you knew something had been taken from you that no one could ever return. Not food, not freedom, not even life itself, but something more. The chance at life that should have come after you. The Reich called it science. They called it medicine. But in truth, it was a weapon sharper than steel, quieter than gas, more lasting than any bullet. It was the deliberate erasure of futures, the slow extermination of people by denying them the ability to continue. And it was carried out not in secret corners, not by shadows, but in bright rooms, by men in coats, with clipboards and pencils, as if sterilization were nothing more than another experiment on the long list of horrors the laboratories performed every day. The camps were already filled with silence and fear, but the presence of children added something sharper, something more unbearable. Their small voices cut through the routine of boots and coughing. Their thin frames clung to mothers until guards tore them away. Their eyes still carried that brightness that adults had long since lost. For the doctors, those eyes weren't seen as innocence. They were seen as opportunity. Children were not spared from the laboratories. They were targeted. They were raw material for another kind of obsession, one rooted not only in cruelty but in fantasy. The dream of controlling heredity itself, of shaping the future by dissecting the present. Twins in particular fascinated Josef Mengele and his colleagues. Identical siblings seem like nature's perfect experiment. Two bodies born together, one a mirror of the other, each carrying the same blueprint. To the doctors, this wasn't a coincidence. It was a resource. If you wanted to study heredity, disease, resistance, or difference, twins offered a side-by-side comparison. One could be injected with a disease while the other was left untreated. One could undergo surgery while the other served as a control. One could be killed so their organs could be examined against the surviving twin. In the laboratories, twinship became a curse. Children were selected at the arrival ramps, pulled aside not for the gas chambers but for the experiments. Mengele himself was often present, scanning the lines, plucking twins from their families with a flick of his gloved hand. To the parents, it was terror. To the children, it was confusion. To Mengele, it was triumph. Twins were sent to special barracks, kept together, fed slightly better than others, dressed sometimes in cleaner clothes. The illusion was deliberate, to make them compliant, to make them feel chosen, to make them easier to use. But the kindness was shallow. It was bait laid before the knife. Daily life for the twins was filled with examinations. Height, weight, head circumference, arm span, chest size, leg length. Every measurement was recorded, every angle catalogued. Photographs were taken constantly, front, back, profile, sometimes nude, sometimes clothed, as if the body could be captured in frames of evidence. Blood was drawn endlessly, often multiple times a week, until veins collapsed, arms bruised and swollen. Spinal taps were performed, thick needles driven into the lower back to draw cerebrospinal fluid, leaving children crying, paralysed temporarily, unable to walk. Injections followed. Some were given diseases: tuberculosis, typhus, malaria, cholera, to see how the illness progressed. Their siblings were kept uninfected as comparisons. Some were given experimental drugs, vaccines in development, chemical concoctions mixed on demand. If one twin died, the other was killed as well, dissected so their organs could be compared side by side. The doctors spoke of control groups, but in reality they were performing mirrored cruelty, balancing agony on one child against the silence of another. The obsession with genetics stretched further. Eyes were a fixation. Blue eyes, in particular, symbolised the Reich's racial fantasy. Children had dye injected into their irises, chemicals that burned and scarred, in futile attempts to alter colour. Some went blind. Some screamed until their voices gave out. Doctors peered into those eyes afterward with magnifying glasses, not to comfort but to check whether the experiment had taken hold. It never did. But the failures were recorded just the same, each scar documented like a discovery. Blood was studied obsessively. Samples were tested for supposed racial markers, differences that might prove superiority or inferiority. The results were meaningless, but the process itself was everything. Children sat on benches, arms outstretched, needles inserted again and again as doctors filled vial after vial. Their small frames weakened, their skin paled, their energy drained, yet the notes continued without pause. Surgical experiments were just as cruel. Some twins were operated on with crude incisions, organs probed, bones measured, tissue removed. Anesthesia was often absent, deliberately withheld to see how the body reacted under raw pain. Wounds were sewn shut hastily. Infection spread. Children lay in beds, feverish and moaning, until death came quietly days later. Their siblings followed soon after, dissected for comparison. The laboratory had no interest in half of the set surviving. The obsession wasn't only about heredity, it was about power. If the Reich could prove that traits like eye colour, skull shape, or disease resistance were rooted in bloodlines, they could justify their ideology of superiority. Children became the tools to chase that fantasy, their suffering ignored, their innocence erased, their future stolen before they even began. Prisoners who witnessed the twin experiments remembered the strange mixture of cruelty and false kindness. Mengele sometimes greeted the children with smiles, offering candy, stroking their hair, calling them "my little ones." He wanted them docile, trusting. He wanted them to walk into the laboratory without fighting. For a moment, they felt chosen, even safe. But the smile was just another tool, a mask worn by a man who would cut them open without hesitation hours later. The barracks where the twins lived carried a strange atmosphere. Compared to the filth of the other blocks, they were cleaner, sometimes even decorated with drawings the children made, scraps of paper and pencils given as distractions. To an outsider, it might have looked like special treatment, but to those inside, it was just another kind of prison, one where the walls weren't only physical but medical. Every child inside knew they were being observed, measured, drained, tested. They slept in each other's arms, comforted by the only warmth they could trust, waiting for footsteps to call them into another day of needles and scalpels. The end was usually the same. When an experiment ran its course, when notes were filled, and blood had been drawn too many times. When infection spread too far, the twins were killed together. Their bodies were dissected in the laboratory, organs compared, tissues preserved in jars, samples labelled with numbers. The doctors saw this as completion. The children never saw anything again. Among the prisoners, the stories of the twins haunted everyone. Adults whispered about them at night, unable to decide whether the children were lucky to be spared the gas chambers temporarily, or cursed to endure experiments that made death slower and crueler. Some envied them for their slightly better food, their cleaner clothes. Others pitied them, knowing that every kindness was just a prelude to more suffering. The children themselves clung to one another, trying to believe they were chosen for something special, never fully understanding what it meant until the experiments began. The obsession with genetics didn't stop at twins, children of mixed parentage, children with physical differences, children considered undesirable by Nazi ideology. All were studied. Their skulls were measured, their photographs catalogued, their blood analysed. The Reich wanted proof for its fantasies, and children were the easiest subjects, too small to resist, too trusting to fight, too valuable as symbols of heredity. If you were one of those children, you lived in a world where play was replaced by procedures, where games were replaced by measurements, where candy came with needles hidden behind it. You didn't know why the man with the smile wanted so much of your blood. You didn't understand why your brother was taken into the next room and didn't come back. You just waited, clutching the hand of your sibling, hoping that somehow together you might survive. But in the laboratories, togetherness only meant you would die side by side. The doctors called it science. They called it research. They called it the future of medicine and genetics. But what it really was, every day, was the destruction of children, the corruption of innocence, the obsession with heredity turned into systematic cruelty. And when the notebooks filled, when the samples were preserved, when the last child screamed and then fell silent, the laboratories moved on, searching for the next set of twins, the next set of small bodies to measure, to bleed, to cut, and to discard. The sound of a pen scratching across paper was almost constant in the laboratories. It cut through the coughing, through the rattling of chains, through the low groans of pain. Boots came and went, doors slammed, bodies were dragged in and out. But the writing never stopped. Every experiment was recorded, every injection logged, every fever timed, every death marked down in neat handwriting. The men doing it rarely looked up. They weren't guards or commanders shouting orders. They were scientists, educated men with degrees, men who had sworn oaths to heal, men who now stood in white coats with clipboards in hand, calmly taking notes while people died in front of them. The notebooks were meticulous. Dates, times, temperatures, dosages, symptoms. A man convulsing on the floor wasn't seen as a person in agony. He was a subject exhibiting motor disturbance. A child screaming as dye burned her eyes wasn't described as torture. It was an ocular reaction. Death itself was never written as killing. It was expiration, as if the body were a candle flickering out instead of a life being taken deliberately. The language disguised the cruelty, wrapped it in the calm tone of science, made it seem less like murder and more like discovery. The scientists often worked in pairs. One performed the procedure, while the other stood back, pen moving quickly, capturing each reaction. The stopwatch clicked, the pen scratched, the body writhed, the notes filled. Sometimes assistants repeated observations aloud so they could be written down more quickly. Pulse weakening, respiration shallow, subject no longer responsive. The phrases echoed flatly in the sterile rooms, like stage directions in a play no one volunteered to act in. They didn't shout, didn't gloat, didn't even raise their voices. Their calmness was what made it unbearable. A man begging for water while his body shriveled from seawater experiments was ignored. His pleas translated into delirium observed. A prisoner injected with poison convulsed violently, but the pen only recorded onset of seizure. A woman bleeding from sterilization procedures whimpered quietly, and the page read only hemorrhaging present. The notebooks were filled with euphemisms, each line another attempt to make cruelty look respectable. The scientists didn't work in secret. They presented their findings at meetings, shared data with colleagues, published papers. Results from experiments carried out on prisoners were discussed in conferences as though they had been conducted in ordinary laboratories. The audiences nodded, asked questions, requested clarifications. Rarely did anyone ask how the data had been obtained. To the scientific community of the Reich, the camps were just another branch of research, another institution contributing to the advancement of knowledge. The screams behind the data were invisible once the numbers were typed and published. Some scientists compartmentalized. They went home at night, kissed their children, sat at dinner tables, laughed with their families. Then they returned to the camps in the morning, pens ready, clipboards in hand, watching as other children screamed while their eyes were injected with chemicals. They didn't see a contradiction. They had convinced themselves that the suffering wasn't suffering at all. It was material. Their professional detachment became armour, protecting them from the reality that they were recording death as if it were rainfall. The guards feared the scientists less than the prisoners did. Guards could be bribed, distracted, even pitied at times. Scientists couldn't. They were untouchable, elevated by education, backed by ideology. They didn't shout or strike. They simply pointed, wrote, and ordered. That coldness carried more weight than violence. A guard might punish you for defiance. A scientist might decide your body was useful for a new experiment. And once your number was written on the clipboard, there was no escape. The notebooks themselves became extensions of the cruelty. Stacks of them filled shelves, lined with neat lines of script, charts, diagrams, tables. Each book represented dozens, sometimes hundreds, of lives reduced to data points. A man's last hours, spent convulsing from poison, filled less than half a page. A child's blindness, caused by chemical injections, took only a few lines. A woman's death from typhus, after weeks of fever, was summarised in a single sentence. The scale of suffering was enormous, but the words used to describe it were tiny, efficient, lifeless. For the prisoners, the act of being written about was its own form of dehumanization. You weren't a name. You weren't even always a number. You were a specimen, an entry, a note scribbled in someone's journal. Your agony became stage 2 hypothermia. Your fear became anxious behaviour. Your death became termination. The scientists didn't see you. They saw only the data, and once it was recorded, you no longer existed at all. What made it worse was how many of them believed they were doing legitimate work. They spoke of advancing medicine, of preparing for war, of protecting soldiers. They convinced themselves that their notes mattered, that the suffering was justified by the progress it would bring. Some even argued that the deaths were not wasted, because they contributed to science. But the science they produced was often useless, riddled with flaws, tainted by cruelty, impossible to replicate. What they really produced was an archive of suffering disguised as research. In the silence of the barracks, prisoners whispered about the men with clipboards. They feared the guards, they hated the officers, but they dreaded the scientists most of all. A guard might kill you in anger, quickly, without thought. A scientist would kill you slowly, methodically, with pens moving calmly as you begged for mercy. The scientists didn't need rage. They had procedures. They had protocols. They had notes. And that made them more terrifying than any weapon. The sound of the pen never stopped. Even when the room was filled with screams, even when bodies convulsed, even when death hung heavy in the air, the writing continued. The page turned, the stopwatch reset, the next subject dragged in. The scientists remained steady, as if none of it touched them, as if they were insulated by the distance between their minds and the bodies they were destroying. But the distance wasn't real. They were standing only a few feet away, breathing the same air, watching the same suffering. They chose not to see it. They chose to record it instead. And when the day ended, the notebooks were stacked neatly, the pens set aside, the coats hung up. The scientists left their laboratories with clean hands, even if the pages they carried were soaked with blood in every line. The next morning they would return, pick up the pens, and start again. And the prisoners would wait, dreading the sound of boots in the hall, dreading the sound of pages turning, dreading the moment when their own agony would be reduced to nothing more than words written calmly while they died. The end of the war did not arrive all at once. It crept closer, a shadow spreading across the Reich, a sound of distant artillery that grew louder each week, a whisper of approaching armies that turned into thunder. Inside the camps, the prisoners felt it in small changes. Guards grew restless, commanders barked louder, orders shifted more quickly. The laboratories felt it too. The men in coats, who had once been calm and methodical, began to look over their shoulders. They had filled their notebooks for years with measurements and charts, with observations written neatly in ink. Now those pages felt dangerous. They weren't trophies anymore. They were evidence. The cover-up began quietly, with locked cabinets and whispered instructions. Piles of notebooks were gathered from shelves, papers pulled from drawers, jars taken from storage rooms. Some were hidden in boxes, labelled innocuously, shipped away to safer places. Others were burned outright, fed into stoves and furnaces until the air itself smelled of scorched paper and ash. The same hands that had written so carefully now tore their own work into pieces, desperate to erase the trail. Years of suffering went up in smoke in a matter of days. It wasn't only papers. The laboratories themselves were dismantled. Instruments were boxed, specimens destroyed. Jars filled with preserved organs, bones, blood samples. All of it carried the evidence of what had been done, and all of it had to vanish. Assistants were ordered to clear shelves, to smash containers, to pour chemicals down drains. Formaldehyde mixed with blood in the gutters, a chemical river washing away what had once been called science. The rush grew more frantic as the front lines drew closer. Trucks carried crates of documents to incinerators, to bonfires built in courtyards, to pits dug hurriedly in the ground. Flames lit the night sky, black smoke curling above the camps as thousands of pages disappeared. Guards stood watch, tossing more notebooks into the fires, the pages curling, the ink bleeding away. The scientists stood nearby, some silent, some muttering about necessity. All of them determined that their names would not be tied to what the pages revealed. But burning evidence did not erase memory. Prisoners watched through cracks in walls, saw the stacks of notebooks carried past, smelled the acrid smoke. They knew what was being destroyed, even if they could not read the words. They knew their own suffering was being turned to ash, the records of it vanishing before the world could see. Some felt despair at this, proof of what they endured disappearing forever. Others felt a grim satisfaction, knowing the scientists were finally afraid, finally admitting, in their silence, that what they had done was indefensible. The cover-ups went beyond fire. Some scientists rewrote their own records, sanitizing them, replacing words like subject with patient, replacing died with treated unsuccessfully. They crafted versions of their experiments that sounded less like atrocities and more like legitimate research. They erased details, inflated successes, buried failures. In these rewritten reports, suffering vanished behind polished words, and cruelty looked almost respectable. These were the papers they hoped to show later, to justify themselves if questioned, to prove that they had only been doctors doing their duty. Bodies, too, were evidence. Burial pits were dug deeper, mass graves filled hastily, crematoria pushed harder than ever. The remains of those who had been cut open, injected, dissected, sterilized, frozen, and burned were shoveled into the same fires as the papers. The Reich wanted to erase not just the data, but the victims themselves, as though destroying the bodies could destroy the truth. Some scientists fled, carrying their knowledge with them, offering it like currency to whichever government would take them in. They didn't burn all their documents. Some kept carefully chosen pieces, the parts they thought might prove useful later. These scraps of data, soaked in blood, became bargaining chips in the aftermath, traded for protection, for jobs, for silence. The cover-up was not only about hiding guilt, it was about preserving just enough to remain valuable. The rush to erase evidence was clumsy in places. Fires left half-burned notebooks, fragments of pages carried by wind, scraps of charts scattered across fields. Some were found later, retrieved by advancing armies, pieced together into testimonies of what had happened. Jars of preserved specimens were overlooked in the chaos, discovered intact when the camps were liberated. The scientists tried to erase everything, but haste left cracks in the destruction. Enough survived to tell the story. For the prisoners, watching the cover-ups was another cruelty. Their lives had been turned into experiments, their pain catalogued meticulously, and now, as the Reich crumbled, even that record was being denied. The fires consumed not just paper, but the proof of their existence, the details of their agony, the evidence of crimes that should have condemned their tormentors. They were left with only memory, fragile and personal, to carry into a world that might not want to listen. And yet, as the smoke rose from the burning documents, as the jars shattered, as the bodies were buried deeper, the evidence could not truly disappear. Too many people had seen it. Too many survivors carried the scars on their bodies. Too many whispers had spread through the barracks. The cover-up destroyed paper, but it couldn't destroy memory. It couldn't destroy the truth that lingered in every fever, every scar, every nightmare. The scientists who had once written calmly while men and women died now wrote nothing at all. Their pens were silent, their notebooks ash. They packed their bags, straightened their coats, and prepared their stories for the world that would soon come knocking. They rehearsed their defences in their minds. Obedience, necessity, science, duty. They told themselves the fires had erased enough to protect them. They told themselves the world would never know the full extent. But the smoke that rose from those fires told its own story, visible to anyone watching. It was the story of panic, of guilt, of desperation. It was the story of men who had spent years pretending to be calm now, revealing that they were afraid. The rush to hide evidence was as loud as any confession. And in the end, the ash that fell from the sky could never erase what had already been done, or the silence left behind by the thousands whose suffering had been written in neat notebooks and then fed to the flames. The fires had burned much of the paper, the jars had been smashed, the instruments hidden, but the war still ended. The Reich collapsed, its armies surrendered, its leaders were dragged into the light. The camps were opened and the world walked inside. The smell of ash and rot clung to the air, piles of bodies lay unburied, and survivors stared with hollow eyes. The laboratories were not hidden anymore. The rooms with tables and scalpels, the cages of insects, the tanks of freezing water. They were all there, silent but undeniable. The notes might have been burned, but the scars on the prisoners could not be erased. The Nuremberg trials began as a search for justice, a chance to hold men accountable for crimes so vast they seemed almost impossible to contain. Among the generals and ministers stood doctors, men in white coats who had once scribbled notes calmly while others suffered. They were placed in the dock, their names called out, their crimes listed, deliberate infection with disease, lethal injections, sterilization, freezing experiments, poison trials, mutilation, torture disguised as research. The world listened as survivors spoke, their voices steady, their bodies bearing the marks of what had been done to them. The doctors defended themselves with the same calmness they had shown in the laboratories. They spoke of duty, of orders, of science, of necessity. They claimed they had no choice, that they were soldiers of medicine serving the Reich. Some argued that the data they gathered had value, that the suffering was justified by the progress it provided. Others insisted they had been powerless, mere assistants following commands. The courtroom became another laboratory of words, where excuses were tested, where guilt was measured in phrases instead of pulse rates. But the testimonies cut through the defences. Survivors described being strapped into freezing tanks, their bodies turning blue while stopwatches ticked. They described mosquitoes released into rooms, the sound of buzzing that turned into fever and delirium. They described salt water forced down their throats, burning their insides until they hallucinated water they would never drink. They described children taken for twin experiments, their siblings killed so their organs could be compared. Each testimony was a wound reopened, a truth spoken into the silence. The photographs helped too. Images of emaciated bodies, of surgical scars, of preserved specimens in jars. The doctors had tried to erase the evidence, but enough survived to strip away their defences. The world could see what had been done, could no longer dismiss the whispers as exaggerations or propaganda. The cruelty was laid bare in ink, in images, in voices. Verdicts were delivered. Some doctors were sentenced to death, hanged for their crimes. Others received prison terms. But not all. Some escaped, their knowledge suddenly valuable to other nations. Operation Paperclip and similar programs quietly collected scientists, relocating them, protecting them, giving them new lives in exchange for data and expertise. The same hands that had written death into notebooks were soon writing reports for new governments, their crimes blurred by the smoke of the cover-ups and the hunger for scientific advantage. Justice was real for some, incomplete for many. Out of the trials came something new, something that tried to make sense of the senseless. The world recognized that medicine itself had to be bound by rules, that science could not be left unchecked, that doctors could not be trusted to restrain themselves if power and ideology tempted them otherwise. The Nuremberg Code was written, a set of principles meant to protect human beings from ever being treated as specimens again. Informed consent, voluntary participation, the right to withdraw, the requirement of benefit, not cruelty. Words written too late for thousands, but necessary for the future. The irony was bitter. The code was born not from progress, but from horror. Every line of it was written in response to the suffering of prisoners who had no choice, who had been cut open, infected, injected, burned, frozen, sterilized, and dissected without mercy. The principles that now guide medical ethics were built on the ashes of their bodies, on the scars they carried, on the silence left behind when they could no longer speak. The Nuremberg Code was not a triumph. It was a memorial carved in words, an attempt to prevent repetition by acknowledging what had been allowed to happen. And yet, even then, the code was not universal. Not every nation adopted it. Not every doctor respected it. The temptation to see people as delta points, as material, as test subjects, lingered. The trials made it clear what had been wrong, but the world still struggled with what it meant to be right. Survivors left the courtrooms with justice half served, their testimony preserved, their lives forever marked, their memories carrying the weight of experiments that the scientists had once insisted were necessary. The birth of medical ethics came too late for them. Too late for the men who drowned in freezing tanks, for the women sterilized against their will, for the children dissected in search of answers that meant nothing. Too late for the prisoners who drank seawater until they hallucinated, who shook with malaria fevers, who coughed blood from tuberculosis injected into their veins. Too late for the thousands reduced to entries in notebooks that later turned to ash. The code was written in their absence, their suffering transformed into a warning. The doctors who were punished went to their deaths without admitting guilt. Some remained convinced they had served science. Others insisted they had only followed orders. Few confessed to cruelty. They stood as they had stood in the laboratories, calm, detached, convinced that what they had done was necessary. The gallows silenced them, but their notebooks, their testimonies, their legacy lingered. The Nuremberg Code tried to draw a line, to separate medicine from murder forever. But the line had been crossed once, and the shadow of that crossing never truly lifted. In the years that followed, the principle spread slowly, shaping research, guiding doctors, reminding the world of what happens when science forgets humanity. The words informed consent, voluntary, benefit became shields against repetition, but they could never undo what had already been done. The ethics were written on top of graves, the ink mixed with ash, the paper carrying the weight of silence that could never be filled. And in the quiet of the camps, long after liberation, survivors carried the memories home. They told their children, they testified to courts, they wrote memoirs. They described the scientists who took notes while they suffered, and the trials that followed, and the words written in response. The code might have been born from those trials, but the memory of the laboratories remained heavier than any promise, heavier than any law. The trials gave the impression that justice had been done, that the world had looked into the laboratories and decided such crimes would never be forgiven. Some men were hanged, some locked away, their names recorded forever in the ledger of guilt. But not all of them fell. Some walked away, not because they were innocent, but because they were useful. As the Reich crumbled, another war began almost immediately, quieter but just as consuming. The Cold War pulled the world into new rivalries, and suddenly, the very men who had experimented in the camps were no longer just criminals. They were assets. Operation Paperclip was born out of this hunger. The United States, the Soviet Union, and others scrambled to collect German scientists before the other side could. Rockets, aircraft, chemistry, medicine. The Reich had poured enormous resources into research, no matter how cruel the methods. Now, in the ruins of Germany, that knowledge lay scattered in laboratories, in hidden bunkers, in the minds of men who had written it all down. The Allies wanted it, and they wanted it badly enough to overlook the stains of blood still clinging to it. Not every scientist taken had stood in the camps, but many had ties to programs that used forced labour, that experimented on prisoners, that treated human beings as disposable. Some had visited the camps themselves. Some had signed off on experiments. Some had written papers based on the data produced by cruelty. Yet their pasts were scrubbed, their records rewritten, their names cleaned. Files were edited to remove words like Nazi or SS. References to experiments on prisoners were quietly deleted. When the scientists boarded ships or planes bound for new lives, their histories had already been laundered. In America, they were greeted not as criminals, but as specialists. They were given homes, laboratories, salaries, protection. They were put to work designing rockets, missiles, and weapons. They advised on space programs, military projects, medical research. Their knowledge, built on the suffering of prisoners, was treated as treasure. What had been called crimes in Nuremberg became credentials in Washington, Moscow, and London. The same hands that had scribbled notes while men froze in tanks were now drawing diagrams of engines and writing reports on propulsion. Prisoners who survived the camps and later heard of this were stunned. They had testified about what had been done, had stood in courtrooms and told the world about the injections, the sterilizations, the dissections, the diseases. And yet, some of the very men they had described were flying across the ocean, smiling in photographs, welcomed into new governments. Justice had been selective. The trials had punished enough to show the world a reckoning, but not enough to erase the hunger for knowledge. The hypocrisy was hidden behind necessity. Government argued that the data was too valuable, that letting it fall into enemy hands would be more dangerous. They justified protecting scientists who should have been condemned, claiming it was about survival, about national security, about staying ahead in a new war. But beneath the arguments lay a quieter truth. Cruelty was forgiven when it produced something useful. In the camps, prisoners had been told their suffering was for science, that their agony served progress. They had never believed it. But in the aftermath, as scientists were rescued and resettled, it seemed the world had agreed with the lie. Their suffering had become a kind of currency, traded across borders, exchanged for rockets and weapons. The screams in the laboratories were buried under launch schedules and classified reports. Some of the scientists thrived. They built careers, earned respect, won awards. Their pasts were hidden so carefully that colleagues sometimes had no idea what they had been part of. They gave lectures, published papers, stood proudly in laboratories that were clean and bright, far removed from the camp barracks where their earlier work had been born. Their accents were foreign, their records sanitized, their consciences silent. Others lived more quietly, their names less public but still protected. They advised in secret, wrote reports marked confidential, contributed knowledge from the shadows. Their safety was guaranteed, not by morality, but by usefulness. So long as their expertise was valuable, their pasts remained buried, hidden under code names and altered files. For the survivors, this knowledge was another wound. It meant the trials had not closed the book. It meant some of the men who had watched them starve, bleed, freeze, or die were still alive, comfortable, working in safety. It meant the world had looked at their scars and decided they could be overlooked if the price was rockets or medicine. It meant that even after liberation, the betrayal continued. The story of Operation Paperclip and its equivalents was not shouted loudly. It was whispered, classified, hidden behind layers of bureaucracy. But slowly, fragments emerged. Survivors recognized names in reports. journalists uncovered altered files. Historians pieced together the truth. The picture that emerged was not simple. It was a story of justice mingled with compromise, of punishment handed down to some while others walked free, of ethics written at Nuremberg undermined by pragmatism in Washington and Moscow. The scientists themselves rarely spoke of the camps again. They buried that part of their past as deeply as their governments did. When asked, some denied, others minimized, others said they had known nothing. The notebooks had burned, the documents had been altered, the evidence had been hidden. Without those records, denial was easier, but memory lingered. Survivors carried it, and so did history, waiting patiently for the truth to surface. In the end, Operation Paperclip did not erase the crimes of the camps. It only postponed their recognition, hiding them under new uniforms, new laboratories, new flags. The knowledge produced by cruelty became tools of progress, but the suffering that produced it remained, written not in notebooks, but in the bodies of those who had endured it. The scientists who had once stood in the laboratories taking notes now stood in new laboratories, their pens still moving, their voices still calm, their pasts buried but never gone. And the world, divided and afraid, chose to let them work, hoping the rockets they built and the data they carried would secure the future, even if it meant silencing the memory of the thousands who had been destroyed to produce it. The war ended, the trials were held, some men were punished, others were protected, and the laboratories themselves were emptied. The tables were cleaned, the jars destroyed, the notebooks burned. But the shadow of what had been done never disappeared. It seeped into medicine, into ethics, into the way science itself was understood. Even now, decades later, those experiments still hover in the background of every discussion about research, every medical trial, every ethical code. They remain not as lessons neatly learned, but as scars that will not heal. The Nuremberg Code was meant to draw a line. Informed consent, voluntary participation, the right to withdraw, these were written to protect people from ever being treated as prisoners had been treated. They were supposed to prevent doctors from forgetting that their subjects were human beings, not specimens. But the shadow of the camps showed how easily those lines could be crossed. The memory of men calmly writing notes while others froze to death made every researcher afterward aware that knowledge could be bought at too high a price. The rules were not just guidelines. They were warnings, carved out of the silence of those who never had the chance to refuse. And yet, the temptation has always lingered. In the years that followed, there were other abuses. Studies without consent, patients lied to, vulnerable people used as material. Each time, the shadow of the camps returned, invoked as proof of what happens when science loses its restraint. Every debate about research ethics, every scandal in medicine, every question of whether an experiment is justified echoes back to the same place, to the barracks, to the laboratories, to the men in coats who once believed their data mattered more than human dignity. The legacy of the experiments also lives in the data itself. Some of the records survived, hidden in archives, copied in secret, retrieved from half-burned notebooks. For decades, scientists argued over whether the information should ever be used. The freezing experiments, for example, contained details about hypothermia that could, in theory, help save lives. But the data was gathered through agony, through death. Could it ever be separated from the cruelty that produced it? Some argued it should be ignored, destroyed, left unused. Others argued that if the suffering had already happened, The least that could be done was to let the knowledge serve some purpose. The debate never resolved cleanly. Every reference to that data carried the weight of its origin. Survivors carried another kind of legacy. Their scars were not just physical, but generational. Families lived with the silence, the nightmares, the memories passed down. Children of survivors grew up hearing fragments, sometimes only in whispers, of the experiments their parents had endured. For them, science itself could feel tainted, medicine untrustworthy, doctors suspect. The betrayal had been too great, too intimate, too carefully disguised as care. The white coat, once a symbol of healing, had been turned into a uniform of cruelty. That stain could not be washed away completely. Even today, when research proposals are written, when trials are designed, the language of ethics is shaped by what happened in those camps. Every requirement of consent, every safeguard for participants, every layer of oversight is built on the memory of what happens when none of those exist. The shadow of the laboratories hangs over the modern medical world like a warning sign. It says, this is what happens when curiosity outruns compassion, when data matters more than dignity, when people are reduced to numbers on a page. But the shadow is not only negative, it has also forced medicine to confront itself, to question its motives, to remind itself constantly that science is never neutral. Science always happens in a world of power, ideology, ambition. The camp showed how quickly the tools of medicine could be turned into weapons, how easily healing could be replaced by harm. That realization shaped modern bioethics, turning it into a discipline of its own, one that exists to restrain as much as to guide. Still, the unease remains. Some discoveries from the Nazi era lingered in textbooks, in research papers, their origins obscured or ignored. Students read about them without knowing the price paid for the data. Others were erased completely, hidden away, as if silence could undo what had been done. Neither approach erased the fact that entire fields were touched by those experiments, stained by the suffering they demanded. The shadow remains in the background, impossible to escape. And there is the deeper question, the one that never goes away. How could educated men, trained as doctors, convinced they were serving science, commit such cruelty? The answer is not simple. It is not madness or barbarity or some alien evil. It is something closer, more unsettling. It is the reminder that science itself is not moral. It can be turned to healing or to harm, depending only on who holds the pen, who gives the orders, who decides what lives are worth protecting. The laboratories of the camps showed what happens when science is stripped of humanity, when ethics vanish, when the pursuit of knowledge becomes an excuse for murder. That lesson is the shadow that never lifts. If you walk into a hospital today, the white coats you see carry that weight, whether they know it or not. Every patient consent form, every ethics review board, every protocol exists because once, in another time, in another place, those things did not exist. Once, in cold rooms behind barbed wire, men in white coats believed they could cut, inject, infect, sterilize, dissect, and discard in the name of progress. Once, science forgot its humanity. And because of that, science today cannot ever allow itself to forget again. The shadow remains. It lingers in textbooks, in ethics codes, in debates, in the memory of survivors, in the silence of graves. It is not just a reminder of cruelty, but a warning about power. What those experiments mean for science today is not knowledge. It is not progress. It is the awareness that progress without restraint, knowledge without compassion, and science without humanity will always lead back to the same place, to rooms where pens scratch calmly across paper while people die only a few feet away. The camps are quiet now. The laboratories are gone, the instruments rusted or destroyed, the walls crumbled into ruins. Grass grows where barracks once stood, and tourists walk through the gates carrying cameras instead of rifles. But the silence is not peace. It is the echo of what was done there, the memory of needles sliding into veins, of stopwatches ticking beside tanks of freezing water, of pens scratching steadily while lives ended. The men who wore white coats are gone, their names recorded in books, their faces frozen in black and white photographs. Some were hanged, some imprisoned, some escaped and built new lives, far from the barbed wire they once worked behind. But their presence lingers in every story, every scar, every word whispered by survivors. They are not forgotten, even when their records try to hide them. What remains are the shadows. Shadows in science, reminding every doctor, every researcher, that consent is not optional, that compassion is not decoration, that progress cannot be built on suffering. Shadows in memory, reminding every generation that cruelty can disguise itself as curiosity, that education is no shield against evil, that even healers can become executioners. Shadows in silence, stretching over graves that were dug too shallow, over experiments that were never worth the pain, over lives reduced to notes that turn to ash. The laboratories have ended, but their lessons have not. They remain here, in the stories told, in the warnings written, in the promises made. They remain as a weight pressing down on every attempt to heal, to study, to discover. They remind us that knowledge without humanity is not progress, it is ruin. And so the story fades, not with resolution, not with comfort, but with the awareness that what was done cannot be undone. It can only be remembered, carried forward, held as a warning. The footsteps in the corridors have gone quiet. The pens have stopped scratching. The fires have burned out. But the shadow remains, stretching endlessly, reminding us what science became when it forgot that people are more than subjects, more than specimens, more than data. They were lives, and they were taken.